If you were to ask me who my favourite all-time wrestler is, well, I've probably got a few answers depending on the day, but Eddy Guerrero would certainly be one of them. The man's in-ring skills obviously don't need too much hyping up. He was a certified genius, as good at telling a story as he was technically proficient, someone who could build layer upon layer into his matches from the biggest strokes down to the finest details, and who could trap you into your seat with just the simplest, most graceful little movement. Eddy is legitimately one of the greatest to step foot into the ring, and of course, he had the story too. His career certainly had its hills and valleys, whether it was due to frustration that came from being considered by certain decision makers as too small to reach the top of the mountain, or due to the personal troubles that came with both life on the road and the wear on his body. This video is, in many ways, about one of those valleys, and yet this valley was what set him on the way to reach the top. His time in the Indies, from late 2001 to early 2002, after being released from the WWF. Eddy's indie period, his time in exile if you will, consists of around about 30 or so matches, a lot of which are thankfully available to be watched. He wrestled all around the world during those 6 months, from the US and Canada to the United Kingdom and a brief stint in Japan, and it happens during a period of major change in the American indie scene which he will become a part of, wrestling several matches against people who would later become major stars, as well as taking the stage against old rivals and friends. It was a time when not only did he truly need to get right inside of himself, but that he, in his words, needed to get hungry again. And he most certainly did. As oversized a talent and presence as Eddy Guerrero might have been in the indie wrestling world of the early 2000s, he put in that work, as professional as ever, with the fire inside him gradually burning once more, even beyond getting the call to make his return to the newly christened WWE. It's a short period in the career of one of wrestling's greatest, but an incredibly important one, and so it's worth examining in detail. It's hardly a rise and fall, but more like a fall and rise. At the time when things started to really veer sideways for Eddy in June of 2001, he wasn't exactly at the top of the card, but was still being kept warm. His second European Championship reign ended on April 24th against Matt Hardy, and from there, in something of a twist of fate, Eddy Guerrero ended up joining Team Extreme, where they would largely feud with the heel X Factor group throughout May. Still, this alliance was clearly somewhat uneasy. While Jeff was happy to have Eddy on board, and somewhat oblivious to everything else, Matt was far more sceptical of Eddy's true intentions, and noticed that he and Lita, both his storyline and real-life girlfriend, were interacting more and more with each passing week. A May 31st six-man tag match really forced the issue. Team Extreme had the match won, but Matt couldn't help but notice that Lita was tending to Eddy on the outside after he'd just landed awkwardly from an over-the-top rope bump. This was enough for Albert to grab Matt off the top rope, hit the Baldo bomb, and win the match for the X Factor. While Eddy said in a shoot interview for RF Video later in the year that there wasn't too much of a long-term plan for this storyline, and they were essentially playing it by ear week on week, one presumes that something of a love triangle may have taken place. However, this match would be the last televised one of Eddy's first WWF run. On the next Monday's Raw, neither Eddy nor the events of last Thursday's SmackDown are referenced, not even when Matt and Jeff face each other in a King of the Ring qualifying match that Jeff would go on to win. It's only explained the week after, on June the 11th, when Jim Ross says on commentary that Eddy injured his knee after being thrown out of the ring by Albert, and that he'd be out for the foreseeable future to take care of several issues. The truth of the matter, unfortunately, was that on the June the 4th Raw, Eddy turned up to the show in no fit condition to perform. He had struggled both with alcohol problems and painkiller issues that largely stemmed from the car accident he had on New Year's Eve 1998, and this was now coming to a head. The storyline changes were to cover up for him being sent to rehab at the Tollboots Recovery Campus in Atlanta, a decision largely taken by Jim Ross following a lengthy and often quite frank heart-to-heart with Eddy. In 2005, JR was quoted as saying that they both cried that afternoon, that he told Eddy he loved him, and he did not want to call his wife to give her the news if anything happened to him. After spending 4 months in rehabilitation, the idea was to gradually bring Eddy Guerrero back to the ring. Indeed, he would work a couple of dates in late October for WWF's Heartland Wrestling Association developmental territory, as well as 2 full-blown house shows at the start of November, defeating Funaki on both occasions. If this had gone well, then the indie one would have obviously never happened at all. But things aren't so simple, and with so much going on, from the struggle to transition out of rehab and back into the real world, to the financial troubles he faced and the complete breakdown of his marriage, Eddy relapsed. On November the 9th, he was arrested in Florida for driving while under the influence of alcohol and criminal damage, a charge he pleaded no contest to, ultimately receiving a probationary sentence. A couple of days after the charge, Eddy was released by the WWF. It was decided that Eddy had to lose something for things to truly change. As detailed by Bruce Pritchard in 2020 on his podcast, Eddy had to go away for a while in order to get better. Jim Ross handled the release, and John Laurinaitis made the phone call to Eddy. In 2022, Jim Ross described releasing Eddy as the single hardest release of his career. This was unquestionably a low point for Latino Heat. In his posthumously released autobiography, Cheating Death, Stealing Life, Eddy Guerrero described the humiliation of waking up in jail and the moment of being fired as what finally, truly, got him fully away from drinking. It was almost as if the release at least removed one thing from his mind, even if wrestling was all that he knew. Still, wrestling was the one way for him to get Eddy right, as he said. And almost as soon as Eddy's release was announced, he was getting calls from independent promoters, and he took his first booking for Impact Championship Wrestling, a New York-based outfit won by hardcore Jack Sabbath. He would wrestle an ICW World title match against the promotion's champion, a then pretty hot young worker named Low Ki. The initial idea was for the pair to wrestle out a draw, but Eddy had other ideas. Normally, said idea for someone who'd been up high in the rarefied airs that Eddy had been would include the phrase, "Well, that doesn't work for me, brother," and wanting to win or otherwise make it squirry. But Eddy went the other way. He wanted enough time to wrestle a match his way where, at the end, he would put the young Low Ki over. Even Low Ki may have been somewhat shocked at that one. The ICW match against Low Ki is available online and is absolutely worth watching. It's an excellent affair in front of a pretty lively crowd. Eddy does indeed work a match in his way. It's one where Eddy and Low Ki trade a hell of a lot of fantastic mat sequences, with Eddy showing a hell of a lot more than he'd had in his last couple of active months inside the Fed. Certainly there's a lot more fire in those eyes as he runs through the crispest of lucha sequences and amazing holds, executing the more physical moves with typical precision, including a vicious brainbuster chain that you could, I suppose, call the Two Amigos. While Low Ki would go on to have a somewhat patchy career for his own reasons, he was absolutely one of the most white-hot acts in the indies back in the early 2000s, and he's a more than capable dance partner, reigning in his own predilection somewhat for endless stiff strikes. And then there's the crowd. With no commentary on the tape, we get to hear a lot of them. Eddy has nothing but positive words to say about the crowd at Elks Lodge in his book, but some people do give him a tough time. You may well hear the odd snarky comment, not to mention the chants of DWI. But it's the ending that comes as the big surprise. Eddy misses a frog splash, Low Ki goes up for a phoenix splash, and Eddy rolls out of the way, but Ki rolls out and recovers quickly. This quick recovery surprises Eddy, who is then caught with a roll-up and pinned. Despite the heavy ovation at the start of this match, and the occasional snark during it, it's the ending that really pops the crowd. I doubt anyone in the audience truly expected Eddy Guerrero, in the more expected role of a former big star, to put Low Ki over clean like that, but put him over he did, and this match would set the scene for most of Eddy Guerrero's indie run. Eddy Guerrero's philosophy at this time was markedly different to a lot of once big stars who'd come into the indies. As he said in his book, he always believed that as long as you wrestled right and had a great match, you could still get yourself over while putting somebody else over. He didn't know at the time just how long he was going to be in the indies, or indeed if he was ever going to come out of them, but he was finding a passion for wrestling that he'd been missing for some time. If he felt like he'd had a bad match in front of an audience of about 25 people, He didn't just brush it off by thinking that it didn't matter because there weren't so many people out there. He was still annoyed if he felt he hadn't given his best, no matter who was out there. When he recorded his shoot interview for RF Video in December of 2001, he blamed no one else but himself for his current position and had no excuses, thinking that was what had to happen for him to recover himself, get back in touch with his own spirituality. Eddie was a very faithful person, and to feel a peace that he hadn't had in a long time.
It's unfortunate that it takes these bad things in my life to get back to where I am, and spiritually, but I haven't had this kind of peace in a long time.
Following on from the low-key match, Eddie would make a return to the Elks Lodge in New York on January 11th, 2002, this time working for Frank Goodman's USA Pro Wrestling, against another former WWF and WCW worker, Devon Storm. We get another very fine little match here, with lots of Eddie's usual superb work, and Storm, most certainly a steady hand, handling with the technical side, and also pulling off some impressive stuff of his own. And there were certainly no chance of DWI this time around from the crowd. Eddie wins this one after Devon fails to cheat properly against the Master. He tries to use a chair, gets caught out, eats a tornado DDT onto it, and then Eddie caps off the win with the Frog Splash. A smaller match against a wrestler named Mike Thunder, taking place for the Elite Wrestling Federation in Houston, is again typical of Eddie's work here. Another back and forth 15 or so minute match, only this time Thunder goes over after a blockbuster. Honestly, little seems to exist with regards to Mike Thunder beyond indications that he was a regular for the NWA and was only active for 6 years, which certainly makes this quite the outsized victory. But that's the sort of thing that Latino Heat was all about, as long as he was given the conditions for it. This period also saw Eddie appear on a couple of televised events, albeit mostly in other countries. We'll get to his brief time back in Japan later, but for now let's go to the UK and a little show called Revival the King of England. This show from Mark Sloan's Frontier Wrestling Alliance marked a recent spurt in young British wrestling talent and was broadcast on the UK cable channel Bravo, with Eddy Guerrero also taking part. After beating Scott Parker in the quarters, he'd take on the anarchist Doug Williams in the semis. Williams is someone else who'd go on to have a pretty fine career, and this is a really good, speedy match with Eddie. It's almost entirely technical and based on the mat, feeling something like an evolution of the classic World of Sport style, and Eddie's more than up for that, even throwing in some British style holds of his own. On this night though, Williams got the win for the home team. After Eddie manages a quick recovery from missing a frog splash, he's able to reverse Williams' Revolution DDT finish. However, Doug reverses a La Magistral attempt, blocking Eddie and pinning him. Fine little match this one. From my memory, the whole show's not bad, if you can find it. On the subject of things that are perhaps less good, Eddie also featured on the Australian-based World Wrestling All-Stars second show, The Revolution, on 24 February 2002, which was their only pay-per-view from the US. Here he has a triple threat against two guys he's unquestionably a lot more familiar with, Juventud Guerrera and the short-lived promotion's International Cruiserweight Champion, Psychosis. This match unfortunately takes place in front of a rather heatless crowd in Las Vegas, but the trio put on the good showing you would expect considering how often they've all shared the ring with each other. Interestingly, it sets something up that wouldn't be followed up on. Eddie actually wins the title after blocking a top rope Rana from Psychosis and following up with the Frog Splash, and his victory and promo ends up winning out Jerry Lynn, who was making his own in-ring return following a release from the WWE. The two jaw-jack and then start fighting, with Lynn getting the better of Eddie after a belt shot and hitting the cradle piledriver on said title, obviously setting up the pair for the next show. An Eddy Guerrero and Jerry Lynn match and feud would have surely produced quality, but of course it never materialised. By the time WWA held their third pay-per-view, April the 12th's Eruption, Eddy Guerrero's indie period was over. Still, this one match is at least a positive from a promotion that was generally somewhat of a late WCW-esque mess. Finally, on the subject of televised things, Eddie did do a couple of spots for the IWA in Puerto Rico. He wrestled a match there against Super Crazy, which sadly I couldn't quite find, although we will be seeing more of this pairing a little later on. So when it comes to Eddy Guerrero's indie period, there's two promotions that really stick out over all the others: Ring of Honor and IWA Mid-South. These are probably where the most high profile and remembered matches of this period take place after all. Here we have a young opponent who's very well suited for him, and a crucial role at the very beginning of one of the highest profile indie promotions of them all. The ROH side of things is what starts off first, so we'll go there. Plans for the founding of Ring of Honor had been worked on since late 2001, when original parent company RF Video needed something to replace the revenue they'd previously earned from old ECW shows, and founder Rob Feinstein decided to start his own Philadelphia-based promotion featuring some of the hottest indie talents around. Eddy Guerrero would feature on their first show on February 23rd with a match that had actually been kind of set up on the shoot interview he'd done with RF Video in late 2001. He said that he'd like to face Super Crazy, and said match was booked for the first show in collaboration with IWA Puerto Rico, with the winner becoming the new IWA Intercontinental Champion. The resulting match between Eddy and Super Crazy was one of the highlights of ROH's first show, a great contest pitting Eddy's wiles against the agility of the insane luchador. There's some particularly great moments. Eddy's brainbuster is, for me, one of the single greatest looking moves in wrestling history, and not only does he chain two of them together, another Proto Three Amigos -1, he also executes one on the floor, which is thoroughly nasty looking. Super Crazy, a pretty damn good worker in his own right, also produces some very exciting stuff, and we're helped along by a really hot crowd, especially seeing as both Eddy and Super Crazy have a lot of history and love in Philly for what they did just down the road from the Murphy Recreation Centre, you know, ECW. The finish here is quite similar to the earlier match with Doug Williams. Eddy goes up for the frog splash, rolls out when Crazy moves, and then tries to catch him with a tilt-a-whirl backbreaker, but Crazy reverses it into a small package and gets the surprise pin. Big celebrations, as well as a show of respect between the pair afterwards, as you generally expect in the world of early Ring of Honor. This first show is also notable for a promo from the man himself. He does a lot of hyping up of ROH and what they're trying to do here, but quietly this is one of the best promos of Eddy's entire career, especially when he talks about how he needs to get hungry again. We'll be getting back to ROH soon, but for now we're going to IWA Mid-South, which, it should be said, has no real relation to the previously mentioned outfit from Puerto Rico. IWA MS may possibly be where the most important moments of Eddy's indie period take place. Not only do we have a little cameo role from another legend who's spending a little bit of time in the indies, but we have someone who ended up having a pretty cool little mini storyline with Latino heat, that being one Phil Brooks, or, you know, CM Punk. The storyline between this pair, a young mouthy pretender and the man who was once near the top of the mountain, may have largely only lasted one weekend, but they'd sure fit a lot in there. On March the 1st Saturday show in Indianapolis, CM Punk, then the IWA champ, would defend his title in a packed triple threat where not only is he facing Eddy Guerrero, he's also facing Rey Mysterio Jr. After the end of WCW, Rey did a couple of Mexico tours, mainly in CMLL but also AAA, and then followed that up with a few indie dates in the first half of 2002, with this by far being the most high profile. Essentially, a lot of it was getting back into gear and getting ready for his own arrival to the WWE, who he had been talking to. Rey is also still unmasked here, having not yet got the approval he felt he needed to put his mask back on after losing it in WCW, although he has started wearing the funky contacts. Meanwhile, Eddy apparently said to Punk and Rey that he wasn't a big fan of triple threats, and so largely trusted them to put the match together. No big deal for Rey perhaps, but all this would be quite formative for Punk. In his own words, he said that he thought he was pretty damn good at wrestling. Until this night when he got in the ring with Eddy and Rey and they just, well, they did their thing. Punk knew pretty quickly that he still had a ways to go to hand with these two, and has commented a lot on the whole experience of working with Guerrero, including repeatedly calling him the greatest ever. On a personal level, Eddy would actually bond a decent bit with Punk during his indie time, something he talks about in his autobiography. As far as this pretty cool match goes, and as much as it's really quite surreal to see these three guys in an IWA Mid-South win, Eddy and Rey in particular, It's a very fun thing to see where Punk shows an awful lot of his potential. Ray's already started deploying the 619 and almost gets the pin on Punk to win the title. However, he falls victim to classic old Eddy cunning. Eddy and Ray do the old Filthy Animals assisted Rana on Punk, but then Eddy immediately tosses Ray from the ring. He hits the frog splash, goes for the 3, and Ray can't make it back in time. New champion! Eddy's got another belt from his indie journey, achieved by being just that little bit sneakier. The next night in Illinois, Mysterio goes to a 15-minute draw with Ace Steel, and following this, as he's making his way back, he bumps into Eddy making his way into the ring with his title. All seems okay at first, but then Eddy does a sneak attack and starts beating on Mysterio. Old rivalries never quite die, do they? This serves to get some heat on Eddy and get the crowd roaring for CM Punk when he comes in to make the save and kick off the title match between the two. Of course, Punk being face makes a lot of sense seeing as we're so close to Chicago. With Eddy being the champ and working heel in this match, he naturally gets the great majority of the offense. Almost every part of the match sees Eddy lording it over the much less experienced Punk and shutting down every single comeback that he tries to attempt, either through cheating or just through being superior. It's a fine match, the crowd certainly gets on Eddy's back, and it does finally end with the fans going home happy. Rey Mysterio comes back to try and stop Eddy from using a chair, and when he gets into an argument with the ref, he surreptitiously slides said chair into the ring. Punk makes a crucial reversal, nails a British Fall DDT onto the chair, and that's enough for the 3 count. Punk regains the IWA Heavyweight Championship after 24 hours, and Ray chases Eddy off. Certainly a nice match to see, with Eddy getting a chance to work as the major heel against an underdog, and again, all of this would prove to be very important when it came not just to Punk's career, but to Eddy's as well. As mentioned, WWE and Rey Mysterio started talking in March. The company were looking to Rey as someone to head up the now SmackDown exclusive Cruiserweight division, and it seemed like Rey's signing wasn't really a question of if, but when. Around the same time, there was also a lot of word from the dirt sheets that Eddy's performances on the indie scene were very much attracting the WWE's attention. He'd had nothing but rave reviews for his technical performances, of course, but he'd also had many positive notes for the effect that he had on locker rooms, how he was using his experience to help others, and perhaps most importantly, how he'd changed and now had his life under control, reports such as those coming from those who knew Eddy more personally. The tongues, it must be said, were very much beginning to wag. For now, Eddy had a set of dates on the other side of the world. He'd been in touch with his old friend Victor Manuel, aka the Black Cat, and had agreed to do an 11-date tour in New Japan that would last the rest of March. Of course, this is far from Eddy's first rodeo with the company. He'd wrestled there for 4 years as the Black Tiger from 1992 to 96, although this would be his first time in New Japan without a mask. According to his autobiography, just before embarking on his tour, Eddy got a call from a rather familiar gravelly voice, a person who dealt with talent relations. John Laurinaitis had talked to Eddy a few times since his release from the Fed, and he'd now had word that Eddy was going on a New Japan tour. Essentially, the gist of the call was telling Eddy not to sign anything and that the WWE were thinking of bringing him back, news which was, well, certainly welcoming to a point. The tour in New Japan was certainly productive. Eddy largely wrestled with Team 2000, mainly Jado, Gedo, Koji Kanemoto and the then current Black Tiger, Silver King, against guys such as El Samurai, Jushin Liger, Katsuyori Shibata, Masayuki Naruse and Wataru Inoue. Some familiar names, of course, some newer ones. Of the matches on this tour, the most important one perhaps is a tag where Wataru Inoue managed to get a pin on Eddy, something that New Japan tried to position as a sort of passing of a junior torch, seeing as how they probably realised quickly that they'd only have him for this one tour. On Eddy's side of things, doing this tour was important when it came to having that consistency and trying to get road ready for a possible return to the WWE schedule, although he also said in his autobiography that he wasn't too happy on the tour simply because he was so far away from home, and that this Japan tour was the closest that he came to relapsing once more. Still, when he finished it up and came back to the States, it was about time to set the wheels in motion. There are some other matches from this whole period that I've yet to mention, a couple of which are also available on YouTube. Eddy did a date for Nova's short-lived Phoenix Championship Wrestling promotion in February of 2002 against Nova himself. The pair went around 20 minutes in another very solid match, with Eddy winning and heavily putting Nova over after the bout. Nova himself was also going to be on his way to WWE soon, and the pair would actually face off again later in the year in Eddy's only appearance on developmental territory Ohio Valley Wrestling's TV show. There's also a match from another PCW, this time Premier Championship Wrestling, a Winnipeg-based promotion, where he defeated Playboy Will Damon in the main event. This is the typically good Eddy match from the Indies, although it's worth noting that a then 18-year-old wrestler by the name of Kenny Omega was also on the card that night, in the curtain jerker against Mentallo, one of his trainers. Of these miscellaneous matches, the one I'd really like to see happened on a February 17th freelance show called International Superstars of Wrestling Super Slam 2, a main event bout on a show filled with soon-to-be stars where Eddy Guerrero took on the fallen angel Christopher Daniels, who was already an indie veteran in 2002. I am pretty sure that this match would have been off the charts amazing, and I've tried my damnedest to find it, but alas, I've come up short. On April 1st, the first Monday Night Raw after the original WWE draft, Eddy Guerrero made his return. He came charging in following a match between Booker T and Intercontinental Champion Rob Van Dam, assaulting the champ and being described as one of War owner Ric Flair's first signings. A mere 3 weeks after his return to the WWE fold, Eddy would win the Intercontinental title from RVD at Backlash, kickstarting a return year that had said feud with RVD culminating in a fantastic ladder match, a very short-lived and awkward program with Steve Austin, and of course, the whole SmackDown 6 period, teaming with Chavo and having fabulous matches week on week, with a feud against Edge being a particular highlight. When Eddy signed back to WWE, he wasn't on anywhere near the same money at first as he was on when he originally signed back in 2000, but all this would work out if Eddy proved that he was well and truly back in business and giving his best, which of course he was. Still, when he signed back, he did have a couple more indie dates on his schedule, and happily, Eddy would do the professional thing and finish up his business. The first of these last 3 indie dates happens in IWA Mid-South, another triple threat on April the 19th, with Eddy facing off against old rival CM Punk, as well as Colt Cabana. Once again, the IWA Mid-South titles on the line, still held by Punk after his victory against Latino Heat the previous month. It's one of the weaker matches here, to be honest. Again, Eddy's not a huge fan of triple threats, and it really doesn't help that this match seems to take place in front of about 25 people in a gym in Dayton, Ohio. Not to say that the 3 guys aren't giving it their all here, of course, it's just hard for them to get any reaction. Lord only knows why this wasn't promoted any better. After the match, which Cabana wins following a small package on Punk, Eddy even gets into it with someone in the crowd who, well, possibly has the stupidest early 2000s nu metaler hair I have ever seen. Looks like a bloody bush in winter. Anyway, promoter Ian Rotten does come out to personally thank Eddy and say how proud he is to be able to say that Eddy Guerrero wrestled for him, which is nice, and Eddy thanks everybody who came tonight, even the asshole with twigs in his hair. I kind of wonder though if this is that one indie match Eddy talks about in his book, where he's pissed off about a match that was, quote, the drizzling shits, in front of 25 people, he was throwing around chairs and cursing, and realising that even if there were so few people in the audience, he still gave a shit because he thought the match was bad. Maybe it was. He does seem rather pissed off at the end, although maybe that was just to do with Twiggy over there. There's something that sounds a whole lot better, that puts a much smoother tie on Eddy Guerrero versus CM Punk, a match on April the 26th for the Pennsylvania-based International Wrestling Cartel. Annoyingly, I haven't been able to find this one, although Punk himself described it in a 2021 interview prior to his return match in AEW. In this last match, the pair went 30 minutes, all the way to a draw, with Punk trying to hang on as best as he could with Eddy, who he quite simply described as a machine. At this point in time, Eddy was already once again the Intercontinental Champ. Following the draw, Eddy, totally unplanned, got on the mic and wanted 5 more minutes with said IC title on the line, just to know if he could beat Punk. Those 5 minutes happened, and Eddy ultimately won with the frog splash. And naturally, Punk was absolutely giddy about all of this, feeling like a kid who loves pro wrestling all over again. This also sounds very awesome, of course, but unfortunately I can't find any recording of this match, which is a bummer. Hopefully it exists somewhere. And now we come to Eddy's final indie match, April the 27th on Ring of Honor's third show, one called Night of Appreciation. This last match is a tag featuring 3 of the hottest and most athletic young Latin American wrestlers around. Eddy Guerrero teams with the Amazing Red against Jose and Joel Maximo, the Spanish announce team. Red and the SATs going against each other has already been a highlight of the early ROH cards, and these 3 wrestlers are precisely the guys that Eddy wants to put over on his last night in the Indies. This last match is a whole lot of fun, very hot, features plenty of the high-flying action you'd come to expect from the SATs, and Red still looks good now, and Eddy bossing it in the ring. The SATs do get a fair bit of heat on him, and even almost get him up for the Spanish Fly, only for Red to intervene, but eventually Eddy's left in there with Jose. The finish is kind of a play on what we've seen for previous Eddy indie finishers. After he and Red hit the Filthy Animal Zwana, Eddy goes for the frog splash and rolls out when Jose moves, but this time Eddy's able to counter again, and he breaks out the old Black Tiger bomb to pin Jose and win the match. Just before the celebrations truly begin, there's one other little thing. Brian Exile, Red's old tag partner, comes out to challenge Eddy, which he duly accepts for right now. Brian tries to surprise Eddy with punches but is quickly overcome, powerbombed, brainbusted, and after just 30 seconds or so, one final frog splash brings Eddy's time in the Indies to a close. The post-match is a suitably emotional affair. Lots of chants from the crowd, the whole of the ROH locker room coming out to applaud Eddy, and a speech from the man himself, talking about how being in this ring makes him happy, how the boys in the back are his brothers, and the fans are family when they're watching, and finally having a proper embrace with the SATs and Red at the close of the show. Later on, Eddy Guerrero would describe this night as one of his favourites ever in a pro wrestling ring, and it's a fine way for him to finish up on the Indies. This whole period may not be the most famous one in his career, but it was undoubtedly one of the most crucial. This was where Eddy started again and pushed his way back up from his lowest point. Without this time in the Indies, well, it's hard to say what would have happened. Even if, tragically, we didn't have anywhere near as much time to experience and love Eddy Guerrero in his lifetime as any of us would have hoped to have, it was this period that helped him start a journey that would lead all the way to the very top. The matches themselves are definitely worth checking out, and the story itself is special. One of the true greats came through the mire, remembered who he was, and became stronger than ever. He got hungry again. Bye for now. It's time for a trip to Funk University. The fact that we've covered so many other foreign talents and not really delved into the funks is, after all, kind of criminal. Certainly when you're thinking about All Japan, as I clearly often do, Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. are about as important as it gets, not just for the company, but for the entirety of pro res. It wouldn't be out of place to say that they changed the whole perception of foreigners in Japanese wrestling back in the 1970s, contributing massively to the evolution of pro res and moving away from how things were in the time of JWA and Riki Dozan. We'll naturally get into a bit of that, but this is one of those videos where the majority of the focus is going to be on a single match, and for all the thousands, indeed tens of thousands of matches that both Terry and Dory had in their career, this is one match that's entirely unique. On April the 30th, 1981, at the Sports Park Gymnasium in Chiba, in an All Japan ring, Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. would lock eyes with each other from opposing sides of the squared circle. It would be the one and only time that the two brothers ever faced off in a singles match, and it happened relatively close to their prime. We're going to be going over this encounter in detail, looking at how it ended up happening, talking about the Funks in general, having a quick little dive into the weird history of brother versus brother in wrestling, and wondering why this bout only happened once. It should be fun. So let's start with these two tough cowboys from the Double Cross Ranch. As much as Terry and Dory are so decorated and held in such high stature, it's good to summarise just how they got so over in Japan. Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. both first made their way to Japan in 1969, when they were booked by the JWA. There's a good few of their early matches there kicking around, including Dory, who was the NWA Heavyweight World Champ at the time, having contests with both Inoki and Bubba, both of whom he wrestled to 60-minute time limit draws in matches for his title. Indeed, the Funk brothers would be Inoki and Bubba's opponents in the B.I. Cannon's last regular tag team match, defeating them by 2-1 on the 7th of December 1971 to win the NWA International Tag Team titles. He was still the NWA champ when the big split happened, and both Funk brothers, as well as their father Dory Funk Sr., were much closer to Bubba than they were Inoki. They would continue to feature in All Japan from the moment the promotion was created, and the Funk's closeness with Bubba helped the new company gain full recognition from the NWA. While New Japan did also eventually get recognition from the NWA after a few years, only All Japan had access to the Alliance as champions. Also notable in this period was the training of a young Jumbo Tsuruta, who Bubba sent on foreign excursion to the Funk's home territory of Amarillo, and his tutelage there under Dory Jr., unquestionably one of wrestling's greatest ever trainers, played a pretty huge part in shaping Jumbo into the all-time talent that he'd become. And obviously that training doesn't stop with Jumbo. As far as prominent All Japan guys go, he'd train up Genichiro Tenryu, Stan Hansen, Ted DiBiase, Mitsuharu Misawa, not to mention all the other major talents that he tutored. That's a list that just goes on. The importance of the relationship between All Japan and the Funk family is hard to overstate. Not only were they the promotion's top foreign talent, they were heavily involved in both the booking of foreign talent and in creative, a role that was originally filled by Dory Funk Sr. and then was passed down to Dory Jr. and Terry following the passing of their father on June 3rd, 1973. What's important to note is that as foreign talents, the Funk brothers were treated pretty differently from what had previously been the norm in ProRes, in which the foreign talents, largely heels, came in and wrestled like heels against the native talents, guys like Freddie Blassie, The Destroyer, Killer Kowalski and Gorilla Monsoon. The Funks were pretty much loved in Japan from the beginning. They'd had the honour of defeating Inoki and Bubba, and before too long they were total fan favourites, the crowd treating them no differently than they would the home team. This despite the Funks being heels pretty much everywhere else aside from their home turf in West Texas. The big differences between Terry and Dory as workers were a big mark in their favour. Terry had the hot brawling style, while Dory was the purist technical mastermind, and in tags especially that basically meant they could work classic matches with any style of team, which they did for generation after generation. Even if they had such different styles and different philosophies on wrestling, it's the sort of difference that would complement each other perfectly in the ring, making them one of the most successful tag teams of all time. One of their most important 1970s matches, and one that illustrates the reverence that the Funks were held in Japan, was the final of the inaugural edition of All Japan's longest lasting tournament, the Real World Tag League, or Open Tag League as it was originally. The Funks had a big hand in the creation and booking of this tournament, and the bold decision was made to book an all-foreign team final, with the Funks taking on the heel team of Abdullah the Butcher and the Sheik. Naturally, a violent bloodbath would be the result, with the Funk brothers winning the first tournament via DQ after the Sheik just decided to start spiking absolutely everybody, including referee Joe Higuchi, after Terry made a dramatic return from the back despite seemingly being cut open so badly that he was unable to participate any further in the match. The Funks, Abbey and Sheik would have plenty of other huge matches in this time, both in tags and singles. It was one of the biggest feuds that the company could put out there, and the Funks would defeat the Heels more decisively in the 1979 tournament final, Dory pinning the Sheik after he got accidentally struck with Abbey's golden spike. The Funk brothers would eventually win 3 Real World Tag Leagues. This mark was eventually matched by Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi when they won 3 in a row from 1993 to 95, but it has never been surpassed. Both Funks were absolute superstars, although traditionally in Japan, Dory Funk Jr. was seen as the ace of the pair. In Dave Meltzer's obituary for Terry Funk, the reasoning for this was explained as being down to Dory being the more natural, traditional champion. He was the NWA champ when he initially came over to Japan, in a reign that would last 4 years from 1969 to 1973, and while Terry would have his own NWA title won over a little over a year in 1975, it was a different sort of reign to the much more classical type of reign that Dory had, with more wild finishes as opposed to decisive pinfalls and submissions and Broadways. Still, it's not as if there was any major gap between them when it comes to popularity. In short, they're right at the top of the tree, and that would still very much be the case in the spring of 1981, which is where we're going to focus. As mentioned in the beginning, Terry and Dory Funk's April 30th 1981 meeting would be the only singles match the pair would ever have. It wasn't the only match where they were on opposing sides though. There were a few tag matches in the mid-60s where the pair faced off, although nothing that's on record unfortunately. There is also a Battle Royal from 1978 which I found details of on Wrestling Classics, where Dory ended up throwing Terry out, although this appears to have been booked more as a cheeky swerve rather than building up to anything major. This was in the very late days of the Amarillo territory, right around the time when the Funks were taking more of a back seat there, gradually transferring the reins over to Dick Murdoch and Blackjack Mulligan. As we'll go into in more detail a bit later on, the idea of the Funks facing each other was entertained a little, mostly speculated on by fans or thought of as something of a dream match, but for most of the time the idea was never entertained seriously by the Funks themselves, and when it did actually happen, it was a matter of having to quickly pull something out of the hat, as opposed to anything by design. So, how does this go down? The backdrop is a tournament for the vacant NWA International Heavyweight title. This is a title belt that was at one point held by the legendary Rikidozan, and it had previously been in the possession of Kintaro Oki. In fact, he'd officially held the belt for over 3,000 days, it being a powerful tool to further cement his godlike popularity in his native South Korea, where it was defended in matches that achieved quite phenomenal TV ratings, while occasionally also defending it in the IWE promotion in Japan. Oki also wrestled quite consistently for All Japan throughout most of the 70s, but for a long time it seemed as though that international belt was off limits. At least until April of 1981. So, how and why did this title get brought into the AJPW? Naturally things get murky and political here, so I had a chat with Kinchstalker, the fabulous ProRes historian, to try and piece it all together. The reasoning as to why All Japan wanted the belt was because of plans developing on the other side, Antonio Inoki's intentions to leave the umbrella of the NWA and form the International Wrestling Grand Prix, which initially was supposed to be more than just a governing body. The IWGP was, in fact, originally intended to be an NWA-esque coalition of promotions, in other words, a direct competitor to the Alliance. Bringing the NWA International title into the fold was a way to combat this, to prevent it from potentially getting into Inoki's hands, and Oki, who was getting close to the end of his career, did eventually agree to it for a trade in which he would be reunited with the All Asia Heavyweight title, another belt originated by Rikidozan that he'd held for a considerable amount of time in the 60s and 70s. When Oki retired the following year, the belt retired with him until 2018, when All Japan made it active once again, and since then it's been on a bit of a journey. Currently it's in BJW. Anywho, the vacant NWA International title's new champion would be decided in a 5-day tournament featuring 8 elite talents: Dory Funk, Terry Funk, Giant Bubba, Abdullah the Butcher, Bruiser Brody, Jumbo Tsuruta, Jack Briscoe, and Tiger Taguchi, better known as Kim Duck. The final, on April 30th, would have seen Dory Funk Jr. go up against Bruiser Brody in Chiba. However, there was a problem, in that Brody wasn't able to compete in that final match. The Intelligent Monster, as he was nicknamed in Japan, was very much on the rise, hugely successful since his debut for the company in 1979, and set to be one of, if not the top foreign talent in all Japan for the next decade, and he was actually booked to beat Dory and win the tournament. However, he suffered a broken ankle in his semi-final match on the 27th against Bubba that would put him on the shelf for a month. And on April 30th, Dory Funk was declared the winner of the tournament and NWA International Champ by default. Still, that leaves the problem of not exactly having a satisfying main event and conclusion to the tournament. And of all the matches available, well, there was certainly one that hadn't been done before. In the end, Terry and Dory thought that the only way to combat the crowd's disappointment at not getting the promised Dory-Brody final was to go against each other. And so, they set it up on the night by bringing the tournament's participants into the ring and drawing lots to see who would face Dory in the main event in Dory's first defence of the title. And of course, Terry got the prize. Terry's pretty cheerful about getting this shot, while Dory doesn't exactly look eager about the whole thing, kind of backing off somewhat. So before we get into the match, you may well wonder why it was that Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. only ended up having one singles match ever in their incredibly long careers. There's a couple of perspectives on this, notably the perspective of Terry himself, who wrote about the match in More Than Just Hardcore, his 2005 autobiography. We'll get to that later, but there are a few potential takes. First off, the dream match can end up being something of a mirage. It seems natural that these two guys should face each other, especially seeing as they're both big stars, big faces. Then it happens and it just doesn't click. It turns out that the fans didn't actually want to see these guys taking each other on as much as they perhaps thought they would, and it ends up hurting both of them. Back in those territory days especially, in the case of Dory taking on Terry, it's not as if thought wasn't given to it happening, but that was the worry. It would actually hurt the popularity of both guys rather than uplifting them. When you consider just how over Terry and Dory already were, particularly in Amarillo and All Japan, the two likeliest places where this possible feud could happen, it seems like a situation where they wouldn't exactly have had much to gain from doing it, but they may well have had something to lose. And also, well, brother versus brother wasn't exactly a done thing at the time. Nowadays we can point at a good few sibling rivalries and feuds, whether they're between real-life brothers or storyline ones. But back then, in 70s and 80s North American wrestling, it was virtually unheard of, particularly against two brothers who were both big stars, to a point where you could basically call it a taboo. The Funks weren't exactly alone in not going against each other. If we go down to Florida, home of the legendary Jack Briscoe and his brother Jerry, yeah, those two never faced each other. They were the Briscoe brothers, and they were always on the same side whether they were faces or heels. The Hart brothers up in Stampede? Nope, never happened. The Guerrero family? Nope, not in the 1980s. The Von Erichs? Forget about it. It simply didn't happen and would never happen. Even if you enhance the scope to Mexico and look at the famous families who wrestled as brothers there, the likes of Los Villanos and Los Brazos, again, it's just not something you would ever see. It's not the done thing, old boy. Storyline brothers could be a little different, but still rare. Arn and Ole Anderson, who weren't actually related, did face off in feuds both in the early part of Arn's career and right at the end of Ole's, but it's not exactly well remembered or a major part of either guy's careers. If there is anything from around the time that gets a little close, it's actually Dynamite Kid and the British Bulldog in Stampede, even though they were cousins. When Davey Boy Smith initially came into Stampede in 1981, he did actually feud with Dino for a pretty long time, with familial tension very much on display. Dynamite famously called him a test tube baby. But eventually all was forgiven, they started teaming as the British Bulldogs from 1983, and the rest was history. So yes, it was very rare indeed. When Bret and Owen Hart had their big feud in 1994, honestly that's probably one of the first instances of the taboo being broken, with two real-life brothers properly going at it, and Bret had some very serious initial misgivings about going through with it at all. There have been more familial feuds since then, whether it's Matt and Jeff Hardy, Dustin and Cody Rhodes, or Jay and Mark Briscoe early on in their careers. And of course there's been some pretty big storyline brother ones. But even then it is still something of a mixed bag when it comes to execution. With all of this in mind, you can see how even if some folks may have thought that the idea of Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. going at it may well have been an excellent one, the idea may well have been different from the reality. And when you put this upcoming bout into the context of 1981, as much as it was hastily thrown together, it's not just something that was unique to the careers of both men. At the time it was unique to just about the entirety of the wrestling world. Well and truly a once in a lifetime opportunity, and it's about time we started getting into the match itself. Now, before we get right into this, I should lay out a little of what to expect. After all, Terry and Dory are about to go pretty damn long. As I mentioned previously, Dory Funk was considered the ace of the group in Japan, certainly on a technical level. Terry Funk, certainly from a modern perspective, is the more exciting one to watch. He's famed for his brawls, his charisma, for matches that could be pretty ahead of their time. Now that's not to say that Terry couldn't go in the ring when it came to the technical game. He could, and with the best of them. However, Dory Funk is the absolute best of them. The purest, the very definition of a grinder who gradually breaks opponents down on the ground, imposes his will bit by bit, essentially defeats them in mind, body and spirit before applying that spinning toe hold and getting the victory. It's this sharp contrast in styles that is potentially going to be the making of this match, especially in this brother versus brother scenario. Who's going to be able to assert their style on the match to make the other try and take them on at their own game? So, as Jim Crockett Jr. finishes his preambles, let's get it on. There is, as you might expect, a respectful start and a feeling out process. However, this quickly answers the question of who's going to assert their style on the match. It doesn't take long for Dory to trap Terry in a grounded side headlock, and this is basically where Terry will stay for the first 10 or so minutes. Now that's not to say there isn't lots of work in this time. Dory cinches that in, and Terry tries his damnedest. However, no matter what he does, how he escapes and then tries to reassert himself, it's usually seconds before he's taken down once again into that headlock. Dory will not let up on it at all. This is the sort of thing where your mileage may vary as a watcher. What we have here is textbook catch wrestling, and in 1981, well, Dory was one of the great practitioners of this. This isn't going to be Kins Road type stuff, so don't expect that. We're fully in SUWA Puroresu school, and especially in the context of this match being between two brothers, it's going to be a slow burner. The grind continues, and Terry tries to power out using his superior strength. He thinks he's got an arm lock on the ground, only for Dory to catch him out with head scissors. As we get near 15, Terry is able to assert himself more when he finally starts to throw a few more strikes. A few forearms and elbows allows him to take a bit of control back and do his own work. Notably though, we're not going to see much of Terry's trademark punches in this one. Still, even with a more extended period of work, Dory is able to get the advantage once again. He spins out of the headlock and starts working a stump puller on Terry's arms. Yes, it is a lot of holds. We do see a lot of struggle in these holds, mind you, with Terry absolutely selling the pain of them and Dory cinching them in as much as possible, working those limbs to make it clear how much this hurts. As the two push hard against each other, trying to turn the other around with their necks, the crowd, who've largely been very subdued so far, starts to get more behind Terry. Terry struggles and tries to turn his advantage into a pin, but it doesn't reach two, and eventually Dory is able to flip out of the hold. Terry, however, has done enough damage that he's able to get ahead in the next exchange, working Dory over with an arm lock, followed by an arm scissors. Dory eventually starts to throw his own elbows to try and regain the advantage, and then he's able to drop toe hold and start working Terry's legs with step over toe holds, deathlocks and the like. Pretty severe stuff. We're about 25 minutes in with both wrestlers back up, and we do get a pretty big bump. Irish whip and Terry hits a strike and runs the ropes himself, but Dory is able to back body drop him all the way over the top rope. If Bill Watts was watching this bout, he'd have been very upset. As you might expect, Dory does not choose to press any advantage outside the ring. Instead, he lets Terry return. It is at around this point in the match where we do start seeing more in the way of impact moves, beginning with a good old-fashioned suplex from Dory. Make no mistake that when any of these moves do come around, they are executed flawlessly. Dory is, of course, sure to still work over that leg, potentially warming up for his finishing spinning toe hold. However, Dory does at times make the mistake of trying to exchange strikes with Terry. A headbutt shows him quickly that this is an error, and naturally it's sold absolutely beautifully by the two guys. I mean, Terry Funk is certainly one of the best groggy sellers there's ever been, and we're seeing plenty of that as this war of attrition carries on. Dory's wiles are still the deciding factor so far. Things look pretty bad for Terry when a rope one leads to him being locked in an abdominal stretch. In the end, both are able to work in this exchange. There's no real advantage either way when they both end up in the ropes. We get another rope one, and a back elbow from Dory is perhaps the most telling strike of the match so far. It seems to hurt Terry pretty sore. The next lockup sees Dory lock in a Guavit. He takes him over and attempts to work it some more, but Terry is able to spin out and execute a backslide for a pretty big near fall. The closest anyone's come to winning the bout so far, and we're getting near to the 35-minute mark. All told, there's not exactly a whole lot to separate the two. At this stage, both Terry and Dory have certainly left a big impression on each other. Dory's response to nearly losing his title is, as you might expect, to slow things up, to pick a leg and again work the step over toe hold. Again, there's not much advantage either way as they get in the ropes. However, this time the break is less clean, as Terry straight onto Dory, grabbing him and hitting a surprise pile driver. However, it's only enough for two. Terry hits a swinging neckbreaker for another two, and we get more struggles of the spirit in a side headlock, but this time Dory reverses out by hitting a big backdrop. Again, this was a time when such moves were very believable finishers. However, Dory is too dazed to go for a quick pinfall. Dory tries to take Terry over for one of his most favoured moves, the butterfly suplex that often leads to either a pin or the spinning toe hold, but Terry is able to resist and we get a rather long battle with the pair trying hard to suplex the other. Terry tries to counter out of a headlock with an atomic drop, but Dory blocks it, spins and hits an atomic drop of his own, resulting in more incredible selling from Terry. We're now around 40 minutes in, and Dory, at this point, tries to finish things off by applying a Boston Crab. He cinches it in, and again, Terry sells it like absolute agony. But eventually, painfully, he's able to pull enough spirit together to make it to the corner. Another big elbow smash leaves Terry utterly punch drunk and flailing, but Dory knows his brother too well. He gets out the ring in order to just not engage with it. Dory continues to maintain the advantage with a couple of postings, but once again he's not quite able to execute the butterfly suplex. However, he is able to hit another backdrop soon after. This almost seems to wake Terry up a little, and Dory can barely get two from it. 45 minutes in, and Terry suddenly looks more invigorated. Again, Dory desperately tries to slow it down, but it's not going to work. It's here where Terry starts to go into his drunken master mode. He clatters into Dory from a rope one and then staggers over for some nasty butts with the point of the elbow. Dory fights back with some shots of his own, but Terry tries to execute the pile driver again. However, Dory backdrops him over the top rope again for another nasty spill. It is around here that we get the best moment of the match. That spill seems to have taken a lot out of Terry, and as he gets back into the ring, his arm in particular seems to be hurt very badly. An elder brother instinct seems to take over in Dory, and he doesn't press the advantage. This is flesh and blood, after all, and Dory wants to make sure he's okay. However, it's also the Funker. Terry was faking the whole thing. He whips around, picks Dory's leg and applies the spinning toe hold. Absolutely beautiful stuff, pulls you right in. Despite being in the centre of the ring, Dory is able to eventually escape. But for once, he got outsmarted. We continue the battle. Once again, Dory is able to get an advantage in the ground exchange after countering a headlock with a knee breaker, with the end result of this being a half crab. Still, it should probably be clear by this point that the last thing either of these brothers are going to do is give up to the other. Terry's able to get up, reverse, and send Dory for his own spill over the top rope, even if he ends up going with him. A big suplex back into the ring, and things become even more bad-tempered. Dory's giving elbow strikes in the corner, and Joe Higuchi actually has to count him. A bit unusual for Dory Funk, it must be said. It's at this point where Dory, at long last, is able to execute the butterfly suplex. However, Terry eventually kicks out, and does so again when a disbelieving Dory tries to pin once more. We're over the 50-minute mark, and we're at that stage where we're not sure just what needs to be done in order for someone to claim the win. But almost in an instant, we get an answer. Terry hits some more elbow butts, really going to town on those strikes on the ropes and hitting a shoulder barge, but when he goes for another, Dory dodges and sends him through the ropes. This appears to make Terry really damn sore. He rushes back to the apron. Dory tries to barge him off, but Terry dodges and goes for the sunset flip, which is exactly what Dory Funk wanted. He rolls out, quickly locks Terry in a double leg pin, and gets the 3 count. After exactly 54 minutes, the battle between the brothers is over, and Dory Funk Jr. is still the NWA International Heavyweight Champion. As you might well expect, there's not a whole lot of animosity after the bell rings, even if Terry Funk may well be unhappy at having been caught out in such a way. The brothers are quick to shake hands, embrace and hold each other's hands up, and Terry Funk puts the international title around Dory's waist. And well, that's it. Terry Funk and Dory Funk Jr. will never wrestle each other again. So what to say about this match? For me, it's a damn good one. In this one time that the brothers had to tell a story, they certainly did that. It started out with a slow burn, a grappling exhibition that gradually turned into a war of attrition, a battle that certainly did get hotter, with emotion getting the better of both brothers at points, especially when Terry pulled out some of the tricks that you might not have expected him to use against flesh and blood. It is a pretty good bout. Is it a great one? There is one big problem with the match. The crowd just never really gets that into it, and there's not a whole lot of heat from them at all. Perhaps that crowd reaction proves that indeed, the ideal of a certain match is better than the reality, no matter the quality of the in-ring action. Even though Dory and Terry are both certainly at the top of their game, it doesn't really feel like the crowd wants to see this. Perhaps there's also another reason. I reckon that the crowd were also fairly certain that this bout was going to be a Broadway, with no winner. As such, there is certainly quite a loud reaction when Dory does get the win. It feels as though the audience really weren't expecting that to happen, and so that ends up being a good swerve. Still, the largely quiet nature of this bout can, at times, make it a tough watch. I wouldn't blame anyone for finding this to be a tricky watch nowadays, of course. This is a much slower pace of match that's not been the norm for a long time now, and if I were to pick a match from this era as a showcase to someone who wanted to know more about this sort of wrestling, well, this wouldn't be the first I'd go for. You'd probably want something like Antonio Inoki versus Billy Robinson, Mil Mascaras against The Destroyer, or Jumbo Suruta and Jack Briscoe. An excellent match, but not really one for beginners. So what are people's thoughts on this one, generally, particularly from those who participated in it? As mentioned previously, Terry Funk did talk about this bout in his autobiography. He said that facing Dory Funk Jr. was probably the hardest match of his career. To summarise his thoughts, he felt that while both him and Dory could have gotten a good match out of a broomstick, wrestling each other was another thing entirely, and the crowd didn't really accept it. It was as if from the moment the bell rang, they didn't want to see Junior beat him or him beat Junior, because they liked the both of them too much. He said that while it was the right thing to do at the time because of the circumstances, there was never any serious idea of the pair ever having a proper feud. While there may have possibly been times and places where it could have been accepted, it wasn't accepted at that time by the Japanese fans. While Terry Funk is in many ways his own harshest critic, it even took him a long time to understand people's love of the empty arena match he had with Jerry Lawler, his explanation is a pretty acceptable one, certainly in light of watching the full encounter. As for Dory Funk Jr.'s perspective on the bout, that can be found on a shoot interview that he did back in the early 2000s. He is a bit more positive on the match than Terry, although he says that he did feel somewhat frustrated in the ring with him, simply because it basically felt as though he was wrestling himself. They'd both been taught by the same tutor, they knew the same holds, they were of similar build, but still, he was happy to have won this solitary match that they had. He doesn't go a whole lot into the background behind the bout, alas, such is the often fleeting nature of questions in shoot interviews, but it's there. There is probably one other thing worth mentioning here when it comes to putting this match between two brothers in the context of All Japan at the time. With all the misgivings that both Terry and Dory clearly had about doing this match, why did it actually happen, even with Bruiser Brody on the shelf? You may well look at the other guys who took part in the international tournament, and you may think that one of them could have pulled it off, even if they weren't exactly new opponents for Dory. Maybe it could have been Abdullah the Butcher, maybe Jack Briscoe, maybe Saruta or Bubba. But it was quite imperative in the Funk's eyes, and in All Japan's eyes, to give the crowd something they hadn't seen in order to assuage their disappointment. And a big part of that was because All Japan, at the time, was running pretty cold. The turn of the 1980s was definitely a period that saw New Japan on top. All Japan were taking a pretty significant beating against them, in fact, to the point where, as Terry mentions in his autobiography, some of the company's foreign talents, such as Killer Carl Cox, were openly wondering if they should keep coming over, because they were just taking a pasting out there. Even in the immediate wake of this bout between the Funks, things would continue to get worse. April 30th, 1981 was actually the final night that Abdullah the Butcher, the long-established top heel foreign talent, was with the company. He jumped ship to New Japan not long after the tour and debuted with them in June. As was covered in the last video, the Funks and Bubba did eventually come up with the solution to the company's woes. That being the pinch-in from New Japan of Stan Hansen, who debuted in legendarily shocking fashion in December. With Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody making such an incredible team, All Japan's business would improve dramatically in 1982, which, well, it certainly helped create a situation in which Terry and Dory would never have to do something as wild as taking on each other again, either before or after Terry Funk's retirement in an All Japan win on August 31st, 1983. An emotionally charged event that was as beautiful and as memorable as said retirement was short-lived. Hopefully you've enjoyed looking at this memorable clash between two legendary brothers, and until the next time, bye for now. I'm looking towards some of my favourite matches, or just bouts that intrigue me and I want to write a bit about, for some inspiration, putting them in a bit of context, going through them, and so on. Hopefully you'll get a kick out of it as much as I will. And we start with one of my favourite Noah matches, a classic and quite different match pitting one of the company's great mid-noughties darlings against someone who hated the company and everything it stood for. KENTA vs SUWA from 2005. How are we going to go about this, Len? Well, this is a title fight. The GHC Junior Heavyweight Championship is on the line, so we should look at the belt's history in and around the match itself. We can go back to reports at the time as much as possible to see the build-up to the big bout, and then naturally after looking at the match itself, we can check some of the aftermath to see what happened next. There's a nice chunk of good things to go through, and it's always fun to look at a pair of wrestlers like these two. I mean, they certainly weren't boring. They were magnificent in two very different ways. So with all that said, let's go back to 2004, a little over a year before this match. On July the 10th, 2004, Noah held their biggest show to date, Departure, their first Tokyo Dome show, headlined by GHC champ Kenta Kobashi against Jun Akiyama in an epic feud-defining clash. Such shows also provide a chance to tie a ribbon around some other lengthy stories, and that certainly happened in the junior division. Since the start of 2004, the junior belt had been held by an outsider. No less a name than Jushin Thunder Liger, who was working here at the time as the head of New Japan's CTU group. Liger defeated various contenders in the first half of 2004, ranging from Makoto Hashi to Kotaro Suzuki, Noah's firstborn native wrestler, before taking on Yoshinobu Kanemaru at the Dome Show. Kanemaru was a part of Jun Akiyama's Stern Nest stable, and had been at Noah since the beginning, one of the many who jumped ship with Misawa and company, frustrated by the lack of opportunities in All Japan for anyone who wasn't a traditional heavyweight. Kanemaru was also, notably, the very first GHC Junior Heavyweight Champion. He was crowned on June 24, 2001 after defeating Pathfinder, Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, and eventually Juventud Guerrera in a tournament. With Liger being one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, and certainly one of the most decorated juniors there has ever been, you might have expected him to treat most of his adversaries in Noah with a fair bit of contempt. And you'd be right. Liger's Noah reign saw some of the very best shit-eating, sarcastic, asshole Liger content you can find. The clapping at opponents' shortcomings, the stretching out of limbs, the cold cock shote palm strikes to the chins of many. The match against Kanemaru certainly started out the same way, with Liger barely treating his opponent as an equal. However, Kanemaru weathered the storm and kept coming back at the legend until finally, at the end of an excellent 17-minute match, Kanemaru chained together two of his signature touch-out spinning brainbusters and kept Liger's shoulders down for the 3 count. The inaugural GHC Junior Champion had regained the title for Noah, beginning his 3rd reign with the belt. Quietly, Kanemaru had been the dominant force in the early years of the junior division. He was starting his 3rd reign, and no one else had won the belt more than once. However, another junior was coming up pretty fast behind him. KENTA was another wrestler who came in from AJPW, dating from the last months before the big exodus. He debuted 4 years after Kanemaru, who started out in '96. He showed potential pretty quickly, moving up the ranks fast. He was a part of Kobashi's Burning group and had made a couple of attempts at winning the junior title. Initially, he entered another junior tournament in 2002 that followed Naomichi Marufuji's vacation of the title due to injury, and he got all the way to the final, defeating Kotaro Suzuki and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi before losing to Kanemaru. Then he ended up teaming with Marufuji from 2003 onwards. The pair would become the inaugural junior tag team champions after defeating Liger and Takehiro Murahama in another tournament. The team of Kentamaru, as they soon became known, would be regular show stealers. They would always be in incredibly exciting, fast-paced tag matches, and the crowd would go more and more wild for them. Hell, it could be said that Kentamaru established something of a blueprint for junior tag wrestling that would last many years when it comes to fast and fluid double team action, high wire sequences, an abundance of super kicks, plenty of stuff like that. KENTA's performances were rewarded in late 2003 with a set of trial matches against some of the biggest wrestlers in the company, crossing the line to take on heavyweights. He would only win one of these trials against Juventud Guerrera, but he showed a lot of fire even in defeats to the likes of Jun Akiyama, Genichiro Tenryu, and Yoshihiro Takayama. It was during this trial series, in an excellent match against no lesser figure than Mitsuharu Misawa, that KENTA would introduce a new weapon that he'd innovated. After blasting Misawa with his signature running Busaiku knee strike, he placed him on his shoulders and dropped him down to the mat, interrupting Misawa's face with his knee. This new move, the go to sleep, came within milliseconds of putting the legend down. And even though Misawa ultimately prevailed, KENTA's new finisher was very much established. On the same Tokyo Dome show where Kanemaru defeated Liger, the team of Kentamaru would defeat the team of Kendo Kashin and Takeshi Sagura, just another successful defence in a list of many, as they held an iron grip on the junior tag titles for 690 days. Finally, KENTA and Marufuji would lose the titles on June 5, 2005 against Kanemaru and Segura, with the more muscular Segura pinning KENTA. The more crucial thing about this loss, perhaps, was that it would finally free up the ever more popular KENTA for another tilt at Kanemaru's junior title, which he'd steadily held onto for a year since the Liga victory. KENTA would take on Kanemaru at the group's second Tokyo Dome show, Destiny, on July the 18th. Once again, the pair would produce an excellent match. Kanemaru was certainly game for a fight here, although it was thought to be pretty obvious in the build-up that KENTA was going to use this big occasion to dethrone Kanemaru at last and ascend to the top of the junior heavyweight division, something that he'd been utterly primed for over the past year or so. Inevitably, after blasting Kanemaru with a Busaiku knee, at last he would win his first GHC junior heavyweight title. By this stage, KENTA was one of the most over wrestlers in the whole company, loved by just about all the fans, particularly the younger ones. His first challenger would be someone who'd come in from the outside, who hated everything about the company and all of its tradition, and particularly detested the new champion. So, here's the background behind a man who is, well, still probably one of the most underrated heels in wrestling that there's ever been. It kind of feels that any list of the great heels that doesn't mention SUWA is just incomplete. He's an absolute artist when it comes to getting heat, as we'll soon see. Anyway, SUWA originally debuted in 1997 as one of the first trainees of the legendary Ultimo Dragon, and accordingly he'd spend most of his first 7 years wrestling for Ultimo's Toriumon promotion, first off in the initial 97 Mexico setup, and then in the Japanese promotion from 1999. You might actually have seen SUWA if you were an avid watcher of WCW back in the day. Billed as Judo SUWA, he wrestled on TV for them a few times circa 1998 and 99 in squash matches, where he was always on the losing end. Still, it was in Toriumon where he established his name as the indie got hotter. He was an absolute shit of a heel, and he had a place in the Crazy Max faction, alongside the likes of Sema and Don Fuji. However, Toriumon didn't last forever. In the summer of 2004, after Ultimo Dragon came back from his year-long break to wrestle in WWE, he decided that he was going to leave his federation and gym behind, taking the name with him. Not that the promotion died as such, it immediately changed its name to Dragon Gate, and it's still one of the top indie promotions to this day. SUWA was dealing with a minor injury at the time of all this drama, but he wrestled on a number of the first Dragon Gate shows before deciding to sign up full-time with Noah in September of 2004. Now SUWA's healing antics would take place on a much bigger stage, and it wouldn't be too long before he'd find his bête noire in the shape of that tipped for the top pretty boy known as KENTA. Just a month into his run, SUWA would team with junior mainstay Ricky Marvin in an unsuccessful attempt to wrest the junior tag belts from the grasp of Kenta Maru, and in the utterly hateful exchanges between SUWA and KENTA, the feud between the two was sown, and the stage was set for what would take place 11 months later. Before that though, the pair would actually have their first singles match on the 24th of April 2005. The heat between the two was already considerable, and there wasn't even time for introductions. KENTA rushed the ring to get the bout underway. There was a lot of hype for this first encounter, but the action here would end up being good, but brief. After only a few minutes, SUWA quickly resorted to fouls in order to get the upper hand. Then he would fish under the ring and find himself a briefcase. After a bit more back and forth, that briefcase would be chucked directly at KENTA's face, with the result being a disqualification. SUWA continued the beating until Takashi Sugiura and Kanemaru rushed in, seemingly stopping him. However, this too turned out to be a ruse, and they'd hit KENTA with an Olympic slam and backdrop respectively, joining forces and teaching KENTA something of a harsh lesson. The short length of this match was seen as a bit disappointing at the time, but in the context of the feud, it makes perfect sense and sets up a lot of story points. The briefcase would quickly become a friend to SUWA, and something that would frequently accompany him to the ring. The immediate result of this post-match attack was an excellent and very hateful six-man match on the 3rd of May between Kenta, Ricky Marvin and Low-Ki, and SUWA, Sugiura and Kanemaru. Definitely another match that's worth watching, and only adds further to the intensity in this feud. But ultimately things do pick up again on July 18th, after Kenta won the title from Kanemaru. Immediately after winning the title, Kenta would challenge SUWA for his first title defence. There is, after all, a great deal of unfinished business there, and Kenta wants to settle the score, even if he has ascended to the top. It's not as if SUWA didn't deserve it by this point. Even if he'd claimed to hate all that Noah stood for, and he didn't even particularly care about winning and losing, he was unquestionably one of the top challengers in the division. He had a powerful offense with lots of signature moves, from his electric chair facebuster to his bombastic John Woo dropkick, and his finisher, an elevated version of the pedigree known as the FFF, which, yes, it stands for fucking, or something along those lines. Of course, all of this great offense was supplemented by the guy using every dirty trick in the book. Referee distractions, low blows, closed fists, chokes, boot scrapes, foreign objects. There was nothing that SUWA wouldn't do. With Kenta's challenge in place, the stage was quickly set for a war between these two that would finally settle the score, taking place at the Nippon Budokan on the 18th of September, the final show of Noah's second Great Voyage 2005 tour. It would become one of the most universally loved matches in the company's history, particularly from the company's most popular era. With admittedly not a whole lot else on this second Great Voyage card beyond a lacklustre Takeshi Rikyo title defence against Misawa, and a pretty decent semi-main pitting Kenta Kobashi and Akira Taue against Genichiro Tenryu and Jun Akiyama, a match to build up Taue for his eventual successful takedown of Rikyo's reign, as it turned out, it's not too difficult for Kenta and SUWA to completely steal this show, but the match that they produce is one of the best that either man ever had in their career. A phenomenal display of high-octane action mixed with storytelling that doesn't just call back to the earlier points in the story, but stands up simply on its own if need be. You can already tell something's different in the air when SUWA struts to the ring, briefcase in hand. There's no in-ring rushing to kick this one off. We get the usual title match preamble, complete with Joe Higuchi reading out the GHC title's declaration, until SUWA snatches it from him and tears the sacred document to shreds. Finally, after a slight fracas during which SUWA does tell Joe Higuchi that he's number one, the introductions are made, the bell's rung, and the match begins. 2 minutes after this, the match would end. There's certainly no slow burn here. The pair go straight at each other with strikes, with Kenta taking the advantage until SUWA goes to recoup on the outside. But Kenta naturally won't let him, rushing him into the rails and then bashing his head on the timekeeper's table. But doing this naturally puts SUWA within reach of a foreign object, and a few seconds of hesitation is enough for SUWA to blast Kenta with the ring bell. And he's not done. SUWA retrieves the case from under the ring, rolls Kenta back in, and then boom! Once again, SUWA slams the case into Kenta's face. Despite a final warning from the ref, he pushes him away and then smashes him again. And the ref calls for the bell. It's a disqualification win for Kenta in 1 minute 34. Not that SUWA even remotely cares. He's raising his arm as if he's won. Because, well, he has in his mind. He's done exactly what he set out to do. Now this is just an amazing step for the SUWA character, really. You sometimes have characters in wrestling profess that they don't care about results, but that doesn't always come across when the chips are down in a big title match and suddenly it's the fight for their life. Now this match right here is unquestionably the biggest match of SUWA's career. Nothing else comes close. And he ends it in 1.5 minutes just because he wanted to beat up on Kenta some more with his weapons and make a complete mockery of Noah, treating the entire process and ritual of these title matches with contempt and disdain. He actually truly does not give a damn. SUWA struts up the ramp, reveling in what he's done. However, he's in for a surprise. Kenta sure as hell doesn't want the match to end here, and nor does Joe Higuchi. Suddenly, the legendary ref and GHC representative is in the ear of the match's Zebra, and just as SUWA's about to leave, the referee announces that another match between KENTA and SUWA is going to take place immediately. Even though SUWA still tries to fob it off and leave, KENTA rushes up the ramp to get him right back, dealing out a suplex on there and a couple more receipts for those briefcase shots. The fight is back on. We get back into the ring, but SUWA's soon back out after a running of the ropes to have a shouting match with Higuchi, and the ref even threatens to take his jacket off. Now that's quite the badass moment. Anyway, SUWA returns to the ring. KENTA still has the advantage and pours more offense onto SUWA, draping him on the ropes, hitting kicks and a big slap to the back of the head. Things slow up briefly, but that doesn't mean the cheating stops. SUWA reverses into a neckbreaker drop, then takes off his wrist tape and chokes KENTA with it, attempting to hide it from the ref. Then we get more wonderful antics. SUWA tries to remove the padding from the turnbuckle, despite the ref's protestations. When he finally takes it off, SUWA whacks the ref on the arse with it, and then chucks the padding at Higuchi. KENTA recovers, and the two strike again, but SUWA nails an eye rake, distracts the ref, and then misses both KENTA's legs with a stunning foul. He turns around and kicks Tsuyoshi Kikuchi off the apron as he's trying to fix the turnbuckle, and as Kikuchi's held back by the referee, SUWA gobs on him. Jesus! All of this magnificent healing takes place in the space of a single minute. The turnbuckle does get fixed while SUWA maintains control with kicks, punches, and a tilt-a-whirl backbreaker. The punishment continues outside with runs into the apron, the guardrail, and more ball-based offense. SUWA picks KENTA up and plants his groin directly into the ring post. The crowd boos him like hell. Not that he cares much. Back in the ring, we get a pendulum backbreaker, but KENTA's finally able to reverse off an Irish whip and land a few of those lethal kicks to take SUWA down. He goes for his swan dive dropkick, but the ref gets a bit too close to SUWA, who seizes the opportunity and pushes him into the ropes, sending KENTA crashing down. Obviously SUWA claims to the ref that he tripped because, well, he's SUWA. We get a backdrop for two and a camel clutch, naturally with some fish hooking to really bring it home. More hits in the corner, and SUWA distracts the ref yet again just so he can cold-cock KENTA with a closed fist punch. A John Woo to the seated KENTA gets a near fall, but then KENTA's finally able to claw back offense, using his boot in the corner to stagger SUWA, hitting a Hurricane Rana off the top, followed by a running boot to send him reeling. A single leg dropkick knocks SUWA down, and KENTA finally hits the exquisite swan dive dropkick. He's getting his movement back, but that fluidity is paired with anger when KENTA pretty much stomps a mud hole on SUWA in the corner, Stone Cold style. Hesitation dropkick, but then an attempted boot in the corner is reversed, and SUWA takes the opportunity for another quick foul. Backdrop's reversed and KENTA runs the ropes, but SUWA hits a flapjack for two. SUWA finds more intensity, and with it he takes more risks. He follows the flapjack with a clothesline off the top, and goes straight into a picture-perfect tope on the outside. A reminder that for all of the guys cheating, he can sure as hell go as good as anyone. KENTA rolls back in at 16, and a lariat from SUWA gets another near fall. KENTA again manages to reverse an attempted powerbomb and hit a kick, followed by his signature strike combo that usually sets up the Busaiku knee. However, SUWA's able to reverse that and land one of his own favourite moves, the electric chair facebuster, for another near fall, the biggest one so far. We're really getting into the last stretches of the match as SUWA tries to set KENTA up for the Triple F, but KENTA's able to block and reverse into a tiger suplex for a near fall of his own. KENTA tries for the go to sleep, but SUWA dodges, hits another punch and goes for the John Woo. KENTA reverses with a Rana and tries for the knee, but gets Manhattan dropped and kicked in the nuts once again. SUWA finally does hit the John Woo and rushes to get KENTA out of the corner for another Triple F attempt. However, KENTA's able to reverse that again, and this time he does hit the go to sleep. However, after all of that, he's not able to go for the pin. The go to sleep is more to get KENTA some much needed time to recover. Finally, the two are pretty much reduced to striking at each other on their knees. They start to slug each other, but KENTA pushes away just that little bit and throws a soul butt which absolutely hits its mark. just below the midriff. Turnabout, at long last, is fair play, and the kick poleaxes SUWA. 3 more absolutely savage head kicks send SUWA down, but only for a 2.9. KENTA readies himself and at last hits the Busaiku knee, but somehow SUWA isn't fully out yet, still trying to struggle up. A couple more absolutely massive roundhouses, a huge double one of the ropes, and then KENTA hits a gigantic Busaiku knee strike, one of his most vicious ones ever. KENTA basically lands directly on SUWA from the knee, covers, and at last he gets the 3 count. KENTA has finally managed to overcome this utterly hated rival. He may never be able to have children after this match, but he was able to successfully defend his hard-won belt and defend the honour of Noah against someone who was absolutely interested in little except pouring scorn all over it and making a mockery of the company even on the biggest night of his career. But even with all that in mind, SUWA still gave KENTA an absolutely hellish time and came incredibly close to getting the belt for himself. The reaction for this match was immediately pretty white hot. Most everyone on the internet utterly loved it for the storytelling and for just how much gold there was to be found in a match like this. Now by this stage we had been quite used to really great technical bouts from Noah, of course, but while the standard here was unquestionable, to combine that with all of the incredible healing from SUWA, that was special indeed. It made for a match with some off-the-scale heat, and something that was certainly different from Noah, but couldn't really have been executed much better, especially when you consider the whole story that had built up between these two, virtually since SUWA's arrival into the company. As much as 4 stars is a pretty good rating, I'm kind of surprised at that score from the Observer. I mean, I would bump that up by another 3/4 at least. For a fair few people, it's gone down as one of the best ever Noah matches, especially from the 2000s. I've seen it being called the greatest match in the history of the company's junior division, and even if I've not necessarily seen everything, it would take a hell of a lot to top this one, seriously. It's one of my favourites. And oftentimes, if I get to a stage where I don't feel that good about wrestling, and don't have much motivation to watch, this is the match that I'll think of, and the one that I'll put on. It'll remind me all over again why I love it so much. There is pretty good reasons why, of all the matches out there, I wanted to cover this one first. So, what happened next for these two? Well, for KENTA, this was another memorable victory, and another step in his continued ascension. He was quickly getting a reputation as one of the most fun and best wrestlers to watch out there. There would be a few more tag meetings with SUWA along the way, of course, and they certainly wouldn't have any love lost for each other. But as for the title around his waist, well, he would hold that for nearly a year, finally losing it to Takashi Sugiura on June 4th, 2006. By this time, however, KENTA was already starting to mix it up with the heavyweights. He'd already had an incredible match against his mentor, Kenta Kobashi, after all. KENTA would continue to be a mainstay in Noah for many years, including some of the company's darker times, although he wouldn't actually win the big one, the GHC Heavyweight Championship, until 2013. He left the company in the summer of 2014 to wrestle in the WWE as Hideo Itami, a few years that would occasionally produce reminders of just who KENTA was, but was often frustrating and marked with a great deal of injury. After requesting his release in 2019, KENTA would sign with New Japan Pro Wrestling, eventually turning heel and joining with the Bullet Club as the Worst Intruder. The thing about KENTA is that in the 2010s people seemed to not think all that much about him, as Noah disappeared more into the background even if he was still producing very strong work, and his WWE run didn't actually do a lot to change that, unfortunately. However, the last couple of years have most certainly seen him come back to his best, and he is definitely quite the different beast now when compared to the younger, fresh-faced guy from 2005 who had all the younger fans screaming, "KENTA!" at him. As for SUWA, well, as previously mentioned, this match against KENTA is absolutely his finest hour, and his most high-profile one. It is perhaps fitting that the match against KENTA would be the only time that SUWA challenged for the junior heavyweight title, although a fair bit of that perhaps has to do with how little time he actually spent in the company in the grand scheme of things. He was certainly still a highlight through the rest of 2005 and in 2006, always acting like the biggest arsehole in the room in a tag and healing every step of the way. He even had a quite cool, albeit rather brief match in Ring of Honor against Bryan Danielson, challenging for the latter's world title during Ring of Honor's 2 UK shows, which took place at the same time as SUWA's 2006 British Summer Excursion, that would also see him wrestle against Danielson in the short-lived One Pro Wrestling. However, at the start of 2007, SUWA surprised everyone by announcing that he wasn't just leaving Noah, but that he was retiring from the ring completely. He had his last Noah match on January 21st, teaming with Minoru Suzuki and Yoshihiro Takayama in a losing effort against KENTA, Marufuji and Takeshi Rikio, before embarking on one final tour, the Japanese part of which ended with 2 bouts against Shuji Kondo and CIMA. His actual final match, at least for a few years, happened at a Toriumon Mexico event, where SUWA was part of an all-time heel team, himself, Misu, Takayama and Ultimo Guerrero. Here's something quite interesting, mind you. The Rudos would lose on that night to a team of Ultimo Dragon, Mil Mascaras, Marco Corleone, Mark Jindrak, and a young 20-year-old wrestler by the name of Kazuchika Okada, who did spend his first 4 years in the business largely on a Mexican excursion, pretty much under Ultimo Dragon's win. That's a nice little factoid. However, retirements aren't necessarily forever, certainly not in wrestling. SUWA did come back in 2013 for Noah, wrestling under a mask as Maybach Taniguchi Jr. for the first couple months of his return. Indeed, it wasn't until he lost to the senior Maybach in a match that his true identity would be revealed. Most of this return would, funnily enough, be spent as a part of KENTA's heel No Mercy group. This pair, once absolutely heated rivals, were all of a sudden together. Alas, this return would be all too brief. SUWA got injured again after a few months, and once again decided to retire, this time for good. Another funny coincidence. SUWA's final match to date, where he teamed with regular partner Gemba Hirayanagi in a loss to Atsushi Kotoge and Taiji Ishimori, took place on the 11th of May 2013 on the final Burning card at the Budokan. Yes, SUWA had his last match on the same night that Kenta Kobashi had his last match. I think that the relatively brief nature of SUWA's career, only 10 and a bit years when you add it all up, probably counts towards him still being not as well known as he should be compared to a lot of other more high profile heels and junior wrestlers, which is a bit of a shame. Still, you can't necessarily blame someone for getting out of the business before those injuries pile up way too much and your quality of life gets badly affected, which presumably is exactly what SUWA decided to do. The case for SUWA being one of the great heels can be made throughout his career, but a lot of it does indeed have to do with this one match. It is his absolute finest hour, the one match that you have to watch to see everything that the guy is all about. For the other guy in the win, KENTA, this is of course one great match of many that he's had over the years in a glittering career. But even then, there's been times when he's been on the sidelines too. This remains one of the very best matches of his first golden period, I suppose, when he was much more of a pretty fan-favourite high flyer, as opposed to the more strike-heavy, arrogant heel he usually plays nowadays. Hell, is it a reach to say that KENTA eventually kind of turned into SUWA? That when he became the worst outsider, he was channeling his old rival? Did this story have that much of an effect? Now that's all projection and reaching, of course. But hey, such analysis is one of the fun things about looking at wrestling and wondering if a story like this one can still have an impact on a guy like KENTA in storyline all of these years later. But hopefully you've enjoyed this look back at a classic, and stay tuned because there'll be more coming. But until then, bye for now. It's probably about time that we did a video with this guy in it. Kazuchika Okada, the guy who defined ProRes in the 2010s, the leading man, the textbook definition of a champion, a man who's done so much to raise the profile of Japanese pro wrestling, continues to do so to this day, and has had more all-time classic bouts than you can shake the proverbial stick at. The Rainmaker doesn't exactly need an awful lot of hyping up, but I thought that this would be an intriguing idea for a little video, especially as he moves on to a new part of his career. His time at New Japan has come to an end, and as I write this, everyone's waiting to see just what Okada's next move will be. But around 8 years passed between the man's full debut in 2004 and the introduction of the Rainmaker at the start of 2012, and I thought it might be cool to look at that time period, the formative years of an all-time great. While naturally a fair chunk of this time was spent in New Japan, people forget that he didn't actually start there. He began his wrestling career under the wing of Ultimo Dragon, wrestling for Toryumon Mexico for his first couple of years, before graduating and joining the New Japan Dojo in 2007. He had a few spots in several North American indie promotions, there's a spot in Noah, and of course there's the rather infamous TNA period. The plan here is to have a little look at as many matches as possible. We're not necessarily going to be covering classics, but there's definitely some curious bouts to be found, including a couple of dream matchups, as well as the chance to highlight some other legendary characters here and there. So let's start by turning the clock all the way back to 2004, where we find an athletic 6-footer, still only 16 years of age, getting ready to make his full pro wrestling debut. Annoyingly, there isn't a lot available online from Okada's Toryumon years, partly because of obscurity, partly because Samurai TV are pretty gung-ho on YouTube, so we'll have to use still images here, just as we would with New Japan. Fortunately, the most important and most interesting match is available, his very first one, from a televised card on August 29th at the Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. Most wrestlers don't have their first match put on television, so when someone's debut occurs in front of the cameras, and it's a singles match no less, well, usually it's a sign that people think the guy's got a lot of potential, Jun Akiyama in All Japan being a textbook example of such a thing. More than that, Okada's debut also takes place against someone who is, well, a legend of Lucha Libre, and no mistake. He's up against Negro Navarro. It's worth taking a little bit of time to talk about Navarro. Him being Okada's first opponent isn't just a case of names being thrown together, especially seeing as Navarro's trained plenty of wrestlers himself. If you're not familiar with his work, he's one of the Lucha greats, a representative of an older era of Lucha, one that was very focused on the crispest, highest standards of technical work, and was an innovator of the trio style that dominates Lucha Libre today as a part of Los Misioneros de la Muerte, or the Missionaries of Death, with El Signo and El Texano. Navarro was, and indeed still is, an expert at this style, still very much active at the age of 66 and absolutely still worth watching to boot. Navarro is one of the greatest technical wrestlers to ever grace the ring, a true grandmaster of the mat. He can very often be found in beautiful, classically styled bouts, particularly with his equally talented contemporary and long-standing rival El Salar, someone who has been in the ring with well over 200 times and counting, but also with other legendary figures such as Black Terry, Eddy Guerrero and Blue Panther. Navarro can be found on the lists for many of today's great technical wrestlers. There's bouts around with him against Zack Sabre Jr., Jonathan Gresham, not to mention plenty of matches with Hechicero, who is just now getting some well-deserved attention outside of Mexico and CMLL. Negro Navarro in general deserves plenty more attention, definitely someone you want to watch if you're in any way interested in technical wrestling. And here, at least briefly, he's against Okada, right at the very beginning. Sadly, the match itself is very heavily cut. We only get a minute and a half of a 7-minute or so match, most of which consists of Navarro naturally tying the debutant up in knots. All too briefly, Navarro evades Okada in the corner, knocks him down, and pretzels the hell out of his poor legs with La Negro del Negro, a painful looking inverted figure 4 that earns him the submission. Still, Okada is given an introduction and some comments after the bout. So again, this is the sort of proper introduction that's only reserved for a definite hot prospect. This show as a whole is an intriguing one, in particular because the American Dragon, Bryan Danielson, was on the exact same card, in a trio semi-main teaming with Los Guerreros del Infernals, Ultimo Guerrero and Rey Bucanero, against Ultimo Dragon, Hiromi Horiguchi and Brazzo di Plata. One of those neat historical coincidences that wrestling tends to throw up from time to time there. Okada himself would continue to work in Toryumon until 2007, winning the Young Dragons Cup in 2005. But before he graduates, we are going to have a look at him in North America, specifically for indies such as the Canadian UWA and Chikara. We've got a few matches kicking about from this period. There's 3 in particular in the fairly short-lived UWA hardcore wrestling promotion from Ontario, Canada, that I would say are definitely worth a watch. First up, we've got a tag team bout from October 28, 2006, where Okada teams with his mentor and trainer, Ultimo Dragon, against no less a team than Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin. The soon-to-be Motor City Machine Guns had actually only just started teaming with each other regularly, but they'd already made a splash by winning the 0-1 Max titles in Japan, and those belts are on the line here. As for the whys of all of this, UWA Hardcore and Toryumon had a nice little agreement for probably around a year or so, starting with Ultimo himself making appearances and taking Okada along for the ride, and eventually leading up to a set of 2 very nice Toryumon vs UWA Hardcore joint shows in 2007. I presume that the agreement itself stems from the UWA's founder, Osiris, also being a Toryumon trainee alongside Okada before forming this promotion. You'd expect a pretty sweet tag bout from the 4 guys involved here, and that's what you get. Obviously the MCMG are just an absolutely beautiful, fluid team to watch. You just love to see it when Shelley and Sabin chain together those gorgeous double team moves, something akin to an even speedier KENTA DX, and they're doing it while being brash and arrogant as all get out. Bloody awesome team, of course, you can barely fault this pair. Ultimo Dragon's naturally going to come in and hit a few of his famed spots at points, from the kick combos to a big outside dive. He's got those legend sort of spots down pat by this point, and obviously the crowd loves to see it. But how does Okada fare, seeing as we're focusing on him? He fares pretty damn well actually. Being the young apprentice, Okada's naturally going to be doing most of the selling here, and he does a very fine job of that, projecting more than enough for the crowd here in St. John's Hall to get behind him, and he's got some nice fiery comebacks in him as well. It's fun in these early matches to pick out the spots he likes to use already, as well as ones he did like but kind of ebbed away with time. Some variation of a slam into a senton has always kind of been a part of his arsenal, and we see that here. A German suplex was his go-to finish in these black trunks and hair days, just to really ram the "I'm a young lion" factor home. And then, well, there's all the giant Bubba spots, which are kind of funny. Early Okada really likes to suddenly get in there with some light chop into the forehead, followed by a big leap in heavy one, not to mention a neckbreaker drop and Russian leg sweep. Pretty much all of these are trademark Bubba moves, and the crowd seems to dig them. Okada definitely shows a lot of potential in this match, only a couple of years into his career. But of course, he does end up taking the pin, with the MCMG taking Dragon out of the equation and then countering a one into the corner, before hitting a double stomp followed by the cradle shock. There's a lot of respect before and after, and this match is a really good laugh. Worth seeking out, I would say. Before we go back to the UWA, we do have a little trip to Philly. Kazuchika Okada's one, and as it happens only, appearance in Chikara in something of a weirder match. He takes part in November 12, 2006's From Zero to Hero card at Lorraine Township Fire Hall in a singles match against Osiris, the aforementioned founder of the UWA hardcore promotion. So I guess you could call this a showcase of sorts. It's also Osiris's only appearance in Chikara. This is, not a good one. The crowd, small as it is rather deathly quiet for it all. It's not as if Osiris and Okada are doing anything particularly horrible, but it all just feels quite slow, and the crowd doesn't help. They can't all be winners in these early years, can they? Okada does the Bubba spots here and really leans into them, even going for a big "come on!" But the crowd doesn't react much to them at all. In fact, it makes them think more of Tatanka than it does Bubba. Part of this was, in fact, to do with a rip. Longtime Chikara wrestler Gran Akuma told Okada that the crowd was absolutely full of Big Bubba fans and that the spots would go down great. Alas, they did not. We won't see Okada get too many wins in this video, but he does here. After getting the ropes on Osiris's reverse brainbuster, he reverses a second attempt and hits the German suplex for the 3 count to a kind of tepid reaction. Show of respect afterwards, and again, what can you say? Everyone starts somewhere. Don't really want to bag on this match too much. Okada's 2 years into his career after all. Going back to the friendlier shores of the UWA, we have 2 more matches here, both of which took place during the UWA vs Toryumon Japan weekend in May of 2007. On night 1 we have a definite battle of Legend and Yunnan teams. Ultimo Dragon and Okada go up against Puma and Jushin Thunder Liger. Okada is still a wee stripling at the age of 19, and the masked Puma, better known nowadays as TJP or TJ Perkins, was 22 and a graduate of the New Japan Dojo. There were plans for him to be an American Tiger Mask of sorts, hence the gimmick, although this didn't really pan out in the end. Anywho, excellent match here. Obviously we're going to get Liger and Ultimo going at it, and they're certainly going to bring the goods, but we're also going to get the 2 Yunnans, and they're really going to impress. Puma had a couple of years on Okada at this point, and he's definitely got some wicked athleticism, but this is absolutely the best Okada has looked to date. He's hanging with Puma on those speedy exchanges and adding more and more to his offense, but I think that the selling is the most impressive, because he's really selling quite big already, bigger than this venue. He still loves those Bubba spots, mind you. If there is one surprise about early Okada, it's all these Bubba spots, being thrown out by a 6-footer who is still, at this stage, classed as a junior heavyweight wrestler. Still, I enjoy them as a Bubba fan, and the UWA crowd laps them up as well. After Ultimo takes out Puma on the outside with a big Asai moonsault, Okada's left with Liger and almost has him in a tight spot, but he makes the mistake of getting caught in the corner. Super Brainbuster, running Liger Bomb, and that's all she wrote. I really recommend this one, for sure. It's a fun tag main event where the legends do their thing, and the youngsters really take the opportunity to shine. And as it turns out, Okada taking the opportunity here was really freaking important. As the official narrative goes, Liger was very impressed indeed by Okada, and recommended that he sign up to the New Japan Dojo, which of course he would do not long at all after this bout. So yeah, it's a good thing that we've got a record of this one. On the very next night, Okada would have a singles bout against Josh Prohibition, the UWA Canadian champion, a title Josh holds despite not being from Canada and being more than eager to tell the fans just what he thinks about Canada. Josh gets some heat in the pre-match promo, and Okada responds by, well, I'll just let him say it.
Fuck you, Josh!
Whoa! Where on earth could he have learned language like that?
You asshole!
Okada! Taking the fight to the Canadian.
The St. John's Hall crowd definitely loves this guy, that's for sure. Now this isn't as hot as the tag from the night before, but it's a cool bout. Josh Prohibition is one of those solid indie wrestling hands from the noughties, the sort who is still going today, and that you're kinda surprised never appeared in ROH or TNA or wherever, whether in singles or with his usual compatriot, the just as underrated Matt M-Dog20 Cross, or Son of Havoc if you watch Lucha Underground. With Prohibition naturally playing the heel, that's going to factor a bit in the finish. With Okada looking for his German suplex, Josh takes the opportunity to land a sneaky low blow, and eventually polishes Kazu off with his Drunken Driver, which is essentially a Tiger Driver 98. And with that, Okada's time in UWA Hardcore comes to an end. The promotion itself seems quite cool, but they didn't last much longer after this following the retirement of co-founder Osiris and the loss of its regular venue at St. John's Hall, meaning that they didn't run any shows for the second half of 2007. While another venue was eventually found, the promotion decided to call it quits with a final show in August of 2008, although there was a one-off show under the name in 2016. On August 26, 2007, Kazuchika Okada would make his first appearance in a New Japan ring, but of course there is still a long way to go. On the show that would mark the dissolution of the CTU, Jushin Liger's long-standing heel group, Okada would be second on in a singles match at the Korakuen Hall against another young prospect, someone who was virtually fully bred in the New Japan dojo and again had a good year or so on Okada. Tetsuya Naito. He himself isn't tranquilo yet, in fact he isn't even the Stardust Genius, but again there's always an interest in looking at such an early meeting between two all-time greats. With the pair sporting the requisite all-black Young Lion uniform, we get a nice bout with a bit of mat work in the first half and a bit of fire at the end, with Naito generally being the aggressor and doing some rather nasty things like a basement dropkick in the corner, a big missile dropkick, and a pretty sharp Boston Crab that was his finish back then. Okada gets some nice offense of his own. He's already got some great height on that dropkick, and yes, the Baba spots are still present, which the crowd does acknowledge. One of these hope spots sees Okada do a rope one, perhaps for a running dropkick, but Naito intercepts, hits a power slam, and does the crab a second time to get the submission. Perfectly acceptable Young Lion type wrestling in front of a generally respectful crowd, and you would have probably expected Naito to get the win here, seeing as he'd been around for that little bit longer. So we've got a few matches for Okada here over the next couple of years as he starts plugging away in New Japan and also gradually gets a bit more bulk on, slowly moving up to heavyweight in the process. So what sort of gimmick does this Young Lion version of Okada have then? What's the push? Well, it's the same sort of thing that Kenta Kobashi had in his younger days, that being the good old-fashioned losing streak. Generally speaking, Okada doesn't win much at all, especially not in singles competition. In 2008, Okada went 4-23 in singles bouts, only ever defeating fellow Young Lion Nobuo Yoshihashi. Now generally Young Lions don't win much in singles, but Okada is fairly extreme. But the quality of opponents tells its own story. He's in there against a lot of very established talents, guys like Liger, Hiroki Goto, Prince Devitt, Koji Kanemoto, all the way up to Shinsuke Nakamura. Even if Okada is losing all of these, it's a definite showcase. A trial series, if you will, and a losing streak angle like this is purposefully built to get a hot prospect over through getting the crowd behind them. Still, the streak of largely losing singles bouts will continue in 2009, where again he doesn't beat anybody who isn't named Yoshihashi. However, he is getting more and more of a showcase in the tag and trio bouts at the same time, and the singles matches also tend to be a lot of fun, with there being some really nice ones against folks like Tajiri and Go Shiozaki, who was the GHC heavyweight champ at the time of his bout against Okada at the 2009 Dominion show. The losing streak does throw up some oddities though. I don't have a visual record of this, but on the 15th of July 2009, Kazu ate a pin against, of all people, Val Bloody Venus. Not even a joke. Val Venus has a perfect 1-0 singles record against the Rainmaker. In fact, it's 4-0 if you count tags. It should also be noted that on January 4th, 2009, Okada made his Dome debut. He's in the curtain jerker of Wrestle Kingdom 3, teaming up with Yoshihashi and Mitsuhide Hirasawa, the future captain New Japan, against Milano Collection AT, Minoru, and Taichi Ishikari. Or, just Taichi. While unfortunately I can't show an awful lot of these bouts because they're New Japan, there's definitely one bout that I would like to put a bit of focus on, that being Kazuchika Okada's one match in Noah, which was part of the very early days of what would end up being the never-ending Noah vs New Japan feud. It's a tag match, and it's one where Okada will share the win with another all-time legend. On May the 6th, 2009, at the Nippon Budokan, Okada teams up with New Japan veteran mainstay Hiroyoshi Tenzan to take on Noah youngster Akihiko Ito and Kenta Kobashi. This is a historically significant card. The main event match, the Global Tag League Final, sees Go Shiozaki and Mitsuharu Misawa defeat Kensuke Sasaki and Takeshi Morishima in what would be, tragically, the last big match of Misawa's career. And here, in the middle of the card, a Kobashi that's ever closer to the end of his career faces someone who is still on the way up. So naturally it's intriguing to see just how they interact with each other. This is another quite fun little match. Not a classic or anything, but an enjoyable watch. While this is a late Kobashi match and he's mostly getting in there to do a whole load of chops, it's certainly fun to see him interact with Tenzan, who's naturally got his own chops and headbutts to endlessly throw. However, both of the Yununs do acquit themselves pretty well in this bout. There's some nice and fiery exchanges between Okada and Ito. Okada gets to show more and more in this tag bout. He's doing a big tope con hilo, he's more than willing to bring it to Kobashi when he's able to, and again he's doing a lot of great selling. In particular, there's a really nice Boston Crab sequence with him and Ito, one where Okada only just escapes getting submitted. Eventually, however, with Tenzan and Ito on the outside, Okada's left with Kobashi. And bless him, he tries his best. He's done some fine standing drop kicks and all sorts like that, but when he tries to run at Kobashi, he gets his block thoroughly knocked off with a lariat. And that's the match. You wouldn't kick this one out of bed, to be honest. Seeing Okada and Kobashi in the same ring, just this once, is a lot of fun. I've never been a big Tenzan fan at all, but he was burly enough to be nice in this tag, and Ito was really good too. It's a shame that his career ended up being quite short, as he chose to retire in early 2010. Okada is certainly getting featured a fair bit during this time period. Even if he is often on the losing end of bouts, he's constantly getting tested against strong opposition and often being given some time to establish his character on the mic and in the ring against some very serious operators. Even if no one could have possibly predicted just how far Kazuchika Okada was going to go from here, despite the losing streak and all of that, things certainly look bright, and much like a lot of other hot prospects over the years, in 2010 he is about ready to go on a foreign excursion. Right before he goes on said excursion, he has a bout on January the 31st against the face that runs the place, the once-in-a-century ace, Hiroshi Tanahashi. Naturally, Okada comes up short once again here, in what would be the very first singles bout between the pair, but he is still able to test Tana a little bit and push against him, eventually losing out to the high fly flow in around about 13 minutes. It's the end of his time as a young lion, and it is now time for him to go elsewhere for a bit and see what he can do. Although, as most people know, that's not going to work out quite as New Japan hoped it would. Of course, it's time for TNA. Those pesky rag sheets announced the news by presenting Okada as someone who has good looks and athletic ability, and someone who New Japan sees as a future star, therefore they want him to get some experience. And yeah, he'll certainly get that. Although most of it will perhaps not be in the ring, seeing as Okada will have less than 20 matches in TNA over the course of his 20-month excursion. Most of them will be either dark matches or at best bouts on Explosion, usually ones where he's on the losing end. In all his time there, he'll only have 2 matches on Impact, one where he largely gets beaten up as part of an utterly god-awful feud, and another where he'll be in a wholly different costume. In short, Kazuchika Okada will spend 20 months being treated like an almost total jobber. If you ever thought that one of the ideas behind the foreign excursion was for it to be a somewhat humbling experience, well, look no further than this. It's not as if Okada won't have a decent match here and there while he's in TNA, but the opportunities by a certain point just seem to come so rarely that no one could really be blamed for forgetting that he was there at all. And the one time that he did get something of an angle, well, we'll get to that. I suppose we should breeze through some of these explosion matches. You get the odd one with a decent opponent, someone like an Alex Shelley or a Doug Williams, but you'll also get a thrown together tag team where Okada and Homicide end up eating a pin to Jesse Neal and Shannon Moore, or Okada ends up getting squashed by Rob frickin' Terry. In what I think in retrospect is a pretty salient point, Big Man Meltz compared Okada's TNA experience at the time to that of Yuji Nagata in WCW, someone who New Japan was clearly very high on and wanted to see used decently, but didn't end up featuring a whole lot on TV. And even then, Nagata got way more spots just on Nitro alone than Okada got in TNA as a whole. Hell, at least Nagata had a manager in the shape of Sonny Ono. Okada had virtually nothing. The common factor here, of course, is that both are Japanese, and with TNA's booking and general state of things being so chaotic and generally terrible at the time, There wasn't much interest in booking a Japanese guy like Okada much at all. There was an idea at some point in 2010 to put Okada in the costume of this character here that I can't really say the name of on YouTube, the one who was a major part of the TNA Impact video game, but this fell through when it became clear there wasn't going to be another game beyond the first one. However, Okada did still end up donning the outfit once in 2011. Perhaps the most intriguing of all these explosion matches might be one of the earlier ones, in which the aforementioned Homicide Okada team went up against Generation Me, or rather the Young Bucks. While the match only goes 4 minutes, I think it's notable as one of only a few times to date that Okada has faced off against the Bucks. In fact, I think it's the only one that's a straight up 2-on-2 tag bout, as opposed to a trios match. It should also be noted that Okada and the Bucks became good friends in TNA, riding together and cracking jokes, and occasionally getting each other out of some tricky spots. The Bucks once got Okada out of unnecessary blading when he wasn't actually booked in a match. Anyway, after a 2010 that largely consisted of job, and not much character at all, TNA would try and do something with Okada at the start of 2011. Although, by God, when you look at what they ended up doing, you really wish they didn't bother. Before this, there is just enough time for Okada to check in with New Japan. He will make an appearance at the Dome for Wrestle Kingdom 5 on January the 4th, tagging with Hiroki Goto against the Noah team of Takashi Sugiura and Yoshihiro Takayama. Geez, that is quite the destructive combination, isn't it? When you get a pair like that together, it's no wonder that they end up taking the W. And in something that must feel way too familiar by now, it's Okada who has his shoulders on the mat, pinned by Takayama following an Everest German suplex. This is all kind of like when your football team's just got this top young talent, and it's taking them a while to settle in. You reckon, or at least you hope, that when they finally do score, it sets the ball rolling and they fulfill all the promise and then some. That's what this period of Okada is like. It's coming, but it just needs a little patience. But first, well, we've got to make our way through the misery that is Okato. He starts appearing in January, allied with Samoa Joe as his mysterious masked cameraman or helper or whatever, and he's a part of Joe's utterly dreadful feud with the Pope, D'Angelo Dinero. The mask doesn't exactly help matters, drawing rather unflattering comparisons with Kato from the Green Hornet. After helping Joe to defeat the Pope at Against All Odds in February, he has his first match as Okato against Pope on Impact, essentially a complete squash where Okato ends up winning by disqualification, but only because Dinero wanted to give him a solid beating with his brass knucks. A couple of weeks or so later, we get an absolute stinker of a backstage segment where Pope kidnaps Okato, ties him up, and essentially tortures him, even pulling a fake knife on him in order to lead Joe backstage. Typically dreadful TNA crap for the time. It's like someone looked at the old Tank Abbott and Big Owl angle from WCW 2000 and decided it would be a good idea to run that back. Just pathetic, really. Needless to say, none of this helps Okato get over in any way, shape or form. He may as well be, I don't know, Ricardo Rodriguez or something. His final match in TNA, once again billed as Okada, came in June of 2011 when he lost a first round championship challenge tournament match to Alex Shelley. It's fair to say that Okada wasn't exactly positive about his time in TNA, saying in interviews long after the fact that he hated the company. Although recently, what with his return to a TNA ring and all of that, he has said that if the whole experience taught him one thing, it was the need to develop a strong character, and that without the hardships of TNA, he couldn't have truly become the Rainmaker. As most people probably know, New Japan themselves were utterly enraged with how TNA had handled their star prospect, and the result of that was the cutting of all ties between the promotions. Before we totally wrap up this section, there is one more curious indie match to look at. While Okada's TNA time is mostly remembered for him being Samoa Joe's sidekick, they did actually have one match with each other. Not in TNA, but in Jersey All Pro Wrestling back in 2010, not long after he'd popped up in TNA. It's not much of a match to speak of. Okada does kind of look a bit of a generic goober here, coming out to One Step Closer by Linkin Park if you please, but you can see that he's putting muscle on. Joe's had some pretty famous matches in JAPW, and it's his first time there in a couple of years, so needless to say he is treated like a god by this audience. This is a pretty short bout, and it is basically an extended squash. Joe runs through a few of the classics, noping out on an attempt at a top rope move by Okada, hitting the big elbow dive, face washing him, and after kicking the bejesus out of him in the corner, finishing him off with the muscle buster. This is currently the only time that Kazuchika Okada and Samoa Joe have ever faced each other, and if the now free agent Okada decides that AEW is where his future lies, hopefully it won't be the last. So, finally we get to Okada's return, where the true story of the Rainmaker begins. Still, this little bit is definitely worth examining, because even with Okada's return to New Japan, and considering just how quickly he went into the main event from there, it still wasn't all that straightforward. People kind of forget, or rather they don't care to remember, Okada's proper re-debut, the first introduction of the Rainmaker, when he came back on January 4th, 2012, inside the Dome at Wrestle Kingdom 6. Mainly they don't care to remember it because it was, by all measures, an absolute shocker of a debut. How so? Well, let's have a little look, at least in stills. Okada's return would be against a rather familiar opponent, Yoshihashi. Yoshi was just about the only person that Okada was able to defeat in singles bouts in the late noughties, but he'd been on his own for an excursion. His had largely happened in CMLL, and he'd certainly managed to wrestle a lot more than Okada got to do in TNA. And so this mid-card match is presented as the return of two hot prospects from their excursions, although it shouldn't be too hard to guess who's going to go over. Why is this debut so bad, Len? Well, for a start, just look at the bloody state of him when he comes out. The oh-so-familiar music plays, but he wears the jacket as if it's made out of a bin liner, his blonde hair is one of the worst dye jobs in wrestling history, and he doesn't have any frickin' eyebrows. Who the hell is this idiot? He looks like that 1-2-3 Kid wrestling figure. The bell's not even run and it's already shit. The match itself is a pretty average one to say the least. Yoshihashi's playing the heel and he doesn't do a bad job of it, even going so far as to gob on the ref at one point, which is kind of ear. But the two don't have much in the way of natural chemistry. Okada hits a nice dropkick, as usual, gets the advantage after Yoshi misses a swanton, hits a kind of weak air raid crash, and that brings us to the finish. We get an unconvincing arms stretched out pose before Okada grabs Yoshi's arm from behind and spins him around for an absolute wisp of a short arm clothesline, which much to the shock of the crowd is enough for the free. The already quiet crowd is kind of perplexed by the whole thing. I mean, this finisher is a complete turkey in every way. It's even worse than the guy's new look. So yeah, not a good reintroduction. Hell, compared to the Okada of 2009, it actually feels like this guy's gone backwards, as if TNA just completely destroyed him, broke his spirit. I've heard some people posit that this match and Okada's new appearance was awful by design, perhaps because that's the only way to justify what came next, so they completely dampened all expectations before the true Okada got to spread his wins. I don't know, are Jado and Gedo capable of such acts of mad genius? It's not something I'd rule out, but it seems crazy, probably because it is. To top it all off, after the cracking main event of the night which sees Hiroshi Tanahashi defeat Minoru Suzuki for what was a Len record 11th consecutive IWGP title defence, who should Len come out to challenge him but this bloody idiot? Mr. Ratchet Salon himself, Just for Men's new spokesperson, who'd previously lost to Tanahashi in the final match before his excursion, is out to cement his return by defeating the once-in-a-century ace and ending his glorious, record-breaking title reign. Naturally, Tanahashi accepts, with the match booked for next month's A New Beginning show at the Osaka Prefectural Gymnasium. The crowd are, well, they're even more perplexed, to be honest. Pretty far from convinced, that's for sure. Absolutely no one could have predicted what was to come. Nobody thought that on February the 12th, Okada would defeat Tanahashi. Nobody would have thought that the difference between Okada on this night in the Dome and the Okada who came out a month later in Osaka would be night and day. the bucket loads of presents, the sheer command of it all, and of course the ever-present Gedo by his side. No one who had seen the rather stinky match that Okada had at the Dome would have thought that this title match would be in any way good at all, let alone be a truly excellent and dramatic title bout. And no one who'd seen Okada beat Yoshihashi with one of the worst finishes of all time could have predicted the authoritative thump of the Rainmaker, as it took Tanahashi's head off and brought the curtain down on his reign. Indeed, a lot of people thought that, as good as this match was, it was all down to a big carry job by Tanahashi, and the decision to put the title on Okada so quickly, someone who may have been seen to have had negative momentum before this, was at the very least an utterly rash one, and at worst potentially catastrophic. Surely this guy isn't ready for any of this at all. But it didn't exactly take too long for most of those people to fall in line. The very next month, appropriately enough at New Japan's 40th anniversary show, Okada has his first defence against Tetsuya Naito, the man he faced in his first ever New Japan bout, and the pair put on an absolute classic, one for the ages. The rest is history. Kazuchika Okada, overnight, becomes lauded as one of the world's greatest wrestlers. The future of New Japan becomes its present, and Okada will be at the helm of the company for the next decade. 7 heavyweight title runs, G1 climaxes, an entire trophy room full of MVP awards, Wrestler of the Years, Match of the Years, the first Japanese wrestler to top the PWI 500, a staggering 27 matches rated at 5 stars or above, including a 7-star match. It's not exactly a bad one, is it? As this video comes out, Okada is moving on to another promotion, perhaps another era. We're still yet to see just what that is, or where that's going to be, but expectations are obviously right up in the stratosphere. After all, he's achieved so much already, and he is still only 36 years of age. With that in mind, it is nice to look back at the early years, where the expectations might not have necessarily been so high, but the promise was certainly there for sure. And happily, he'd deliver on it all and then some. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now. June the 9th, 1987. One of the days that will truly go down as a day in the history of professional wrestling. On this day, a man like no other stepped inside the hallowed halls of the Nippon Budokan and into an all-Japan pro wrestling ring. Muhammad Malik Khan, better known as Raja Lion. 7 feet 2 inches tall and 286 pounds, a truly awesome sight to behold, making his professional debut against one of the most beloved wrestlers there has ever been, Giant Baba. Apparently this man had won hundreds of kickboxing and karate tournaments back in his native Pakistan. Indeed, he had never once been defeated. Could the legendary Baba, the man with the heart and soul of a true champion, overcome this formidable foe like no other? Well, yes he could. We can perhaps stop with the mock grandiosity now, for Giant Baba vs Raja Lion is, of course, known not just as the very worst match to ever occur in an All Japan win, but one of the worst matches ever, full stop. It's a classic pro wrestling meme, and it basically has been ever since one of the very best in the business, Matthew of Botchamania, dredged this titanic battle up from the depths to feature it in one of his vids, much to the shock and hilarity of everyone who watched. But, well, just what is the story behind the match? I thought I'd do a little vid about it because it is most certainly amusing in the end. It is indeed an All Japan match like no other, for various reasons, and having a proper look at it begs the question if this actual bout was supposed to be any good at all. With all the evidence laid out, it's actually probably accurate to say that it wasn't. It is quite amusing to me that, in the modern internet age and at least in the West, this may be one of Giant Baba's most famous, or infamous, matches. Something that might even be called as evidence to suggest that the man was himself a terrible wrestler. But this match can't quite be pigeonholed so easily. So let's have a little dive into this one. This isn't going to be a long old documentary like some of the other videos on this channel, but it should be a good laugh. The first question, of course, is who exactly Raja Lion even was. Some say that Bubba spotted him in a restaurant somewhere, thought he looked good and decided to bring him in. However, this was probably just a joke. From all that I could find, it appears as though Raja Lion was an actor in his native Pakistan, although it's hard to find too much info on films that he starred in. He does have a single credit on IMDb for the 1989 film Blood Fight starring Bolo Yun. There's also a clip of him going around where he's on that high watermark of Quality Entertainment, a Japanese variety TV show, where essentially everyone coos about how tall he is. In any case, in storyline, Raja Lion gets brought into the world of All Japan by Tigerjeet Singh, one of the top foreign heels, as a part of his own long-running feud with Bubba. Truly, this 7-foot 2-inch monster from Lahore is someone who Bubba can't possibly hope to beat. From what I can tell, Raja Lion first appears on the May 2nd episode of All Japan's TV show, on a show that was taped the previous day at Korakuen Hall. He comes in, all tall and everything, and has a little sparring exhibition against someone with long hair and big sideburns who, unfortunately, I do not know. The almighty Lion shrugs off this ordinary man's feeble attempts at kicking, while he's able to take him down with just the slightest of touches. Indeed, sometimes just the very force of the wind from Raja's strikes is enough to send this man reeling. This showcase doesn't last too long, and afterwards Raja Lion gets on the mic to shout, "Bubba, come on!" and do some dance moves. As the crowd chants Bubba's name, we do see him in the back. He's stoically preparing for a bout where he'll be teaming with the debuting John Tenta against another age-old rival, Rusha Kimura, and Goro Tsurumi. However, Bubba has clearly heard the challenge that has been put to him. As Raja sparred with his completely inferior opponent, the audience at the Korakuen Hall were so shocked as to be laughing at the sheer power of his strikes, such was their swiftness and ferocity. But in any case, and despite the clearly high risks to his soul, mind and body, Bubba accepted the challenge. He and Raja Lion would meet at the Nippon Budokan on June the 9th in a special match consisting of 10 3-minute rounds that was actually dubbed as a super fight. Yes, a super fight. There does actually exist a hype package for the match, available on the June the 6th episode of All Japan TV. Here I am, as is often the case, very thankful to Roy Lucier's absolutely essential All Japan channel here on YouTube, for he has chronicled and uploaded hundreds of episodes of classic All Japan TV. Unfortunately, the copy of the tape gets a bit screwy here, but we do see Raja Lion practicing those venomous kicks on a sparring dummy, presumably with an approving Tigerjeet Singh nodding in the background while Burning Heart by Survivor plays. The hype is most certainly real. And with that, well, we get to the match itself. Let's break it down. Raja Lion, accompanied by the indelibly funky sounds of Soweto by Jeffrey Osborne, has to duck slightly to enter the arena, receiving the usual flowers and what have you, before the almighty Bubba makes his entrance to, of course, Soul of a Champion. We have the introductions, and the super fight begins. Raja immediately goes in with his lethal kicks and, yes, it does take him about 10 seconds or so to fall flat on his arse, which he will do another couple of times during the first round. The first stanza is all about Raja's neat feet. They try to assault Bubba in as many as 2 different ways, with complex left and right combos that, yes, often just tend to pass through the air above Bubba's head, although he will sometimes vary things with a couple of chops. It doesn't take too long for the great champion to recognise the pattern, and even in this first round Bubba's able to grab an arm lock only for the Lion to be saved by the ropes, and is also able to grab a leg and take Raja down. Raja's in a troubled position at the end of the first round, with Bubba continuing to try for that arm, but the bell saves him. As Lord Humongous watches on, the participants kick off the second round. Raja tries to make more of an impression with those big legs, of course, for that is his sole attack. It almost seems like he has Bubba on the ropes at a couple of points. However, in an incredible Muhammad Ali-esque move at around a minute in, Bubba bounces off those ropes, grabs that arm, controls the back, and takes Raja down. There is no escape as Bubba methodically, slowly cinches in an armbar, and eventually, with the ropes nowhere in sight, Raja Lion is forced to give best to his legendary opponent. As soon as the match is over, an enraged Tigerjeet Singh rushes the ring to assault Baba with the pommel of his sword, also giving poor Raja a couple of whacks. However, the ring is soon cleared, and Baba is even sporting enough to raise Raja Lion's hand in recognition of his brave efforts. This particular titanic tussle is over. So, yes, this match is terrible. Of course it is. It's perfectly awful in every way. Raja Lion has roundly been described as one of the most uncoordinated men to ever enter a wrestling ring, and he wouldn't do so again after this bout. Raja was one and done, at least as far as the records on sites like Cage Match go. The audience seemed to find the whole thing rather amusing really, enough to get some good cheering in during the bout and egg the wrestlers on. But still, this is Giant Baba we're talking about, and if we're honest, an All Japan win would have cheered if he'd just gone in the ring and emptied his bowels. In the grand scheme of things, this was just another little chapter in the general rivalry between Baba and Tigerjeet Singh, who would wrestle each other for the umpteenth time the following week as a result of this bout in a match that was, unsurprisingly, not a work rate classic. Still, for the most part, Baba wasn't about work rate classics at this time. This match comes a few years after Baba decided to take a step back on the card to let younger guys like Jumbo Tsuruta and Genichiro Tenryu take over the main event, relegating himself to tag bouts that were often comedic in nature. Baba had his own little world on the card, usually against rivals like Tigerjeet Singh or Rusha Kimura that he'd worked with for a long time, and this Raja Lion match, while it was actually the semi-main on the night, believe it or not, was a rather unique part of that. Baba didn't put on anything like this bout again before or after. But why did he put it on at all? I think the whole nature of this bout, the silliness of it, the fact that it was billed as a super fight and what have you, is all meant to be something of a parody. This is Baba's take on the sort of match that Antonio Inoki would put on all the time, with matches that were largely worked against martial artists, catch wrestlers, boxers and the like from around the world. I think Raja Lion, specifically, with his amateurish kicks and general build, long legs and all, is meant to take the role of the monster man Everett Eddy, a legit American karate champion who faced Inoki in one of his more famous super fights a decade previously in a match that, well, frankly, isn't too much better than this one. Much like Inoki's endless attempts to challenge Baba himself to a legitimate wrestling match, Baba didn't think a whole lot of Inoki doing all these super fights. Unsurprisingly really, seeing as Baba was solely interested in promoting pro-res and nothing else besides that. He often said of Inoki's challengers towards him that he was interested in pro wrestling, not street fighting. So yes, in a weird sort of way, Giant Baba vs Raja Lion is, most probably, kind of meant to be really bad. Sort of like Baba proving a point. Does that actually make it in any way a good watch, or anything more than a part of the bickering between Puro's two most powerful men? Well no, of course not. It is still an utter dog of a bout that wouldn't have had any business being on a card staged in an abandoned love hotel, let alone the frickin' Budokan. But it does add a bit more amusing interest to the whole debacle. Happily, it wasn't something that Baba repeated. In the times before this match was introduced to whole new generations of wrestling smarks and IWC denizens by Matthew, this match was still somewhat infamous. Looking through archives of The Observer, I can find references to it from all the way back in 1988, when Big Man Meltz described a global wrestling match in Florida between a 63-year-old Ox Baker and the big heavyweight wrestler Hillbilly Jr. as even worse than Baba vs Raja Lion. I'd hoped to find this match and compare the two, for science, but sadly I couldn't track it down. It is also worth noting that All Japan themselves recognised the badness of the match in 1992 when they ran a historical special highlighting some of the best and worst bouts from the company's history. And yes, Baba vs Raja Lion was featured on the show. And as for where Raja himself is now, well, as of a few years ago, it appears that he was working as a security guard in Dubai. If the dates that are down for him are correct, he would be 57 years old now. He was only 21 when the superest of all fights with Bubba took place. It should be noted that only a few months after this, he narrowly avoided tragedy. Tigerjeet Singh booked Rajaline for a winter tour in South Africa. On November the 27th, he decided to take a flight later than the one he was scheduled for, and the flight that he was scheduled on, South African Airways Flight 295, would catch fire in the air and crash into the Indian Ocean. All 159 people aboard lost their lives, including All Japan wrestler Kazuhara Sonoda, Kenta Kobashi's co-trainer, as well as Sonoda's wife. Finally, well, he was immortalised in another way, by the makers of the most legendary series of pro wrestling games. Rajaline was included as an unlockable in 2 Fire Pro wrestling titles, Final Fire Pro on the Game Boy Advance and the WonderSwan edition. This here is an accurate recreation of Fire Pro's Rajaline running in Fire Pro Wrestling World, naturally against Bubba. And as you might expect, he has virtually no moves and an overall total of 35 points, making him functionally useless. But at least you can recreate this tussle whenever you want. And with that, I think we have just about exhausted everything on this classic pro wrestling meme. It may be one of the worst matches of all time, but there is certainly a little bit of intriguing story behind it. It is something you should probably watch at least once, just to say that, you've done it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little look back at the bout, and until the next time, bye for now. It doesn't really matter what degree you know of Pro Res. If you know it, you know these 2 names. Giant Bubba and Antonio Inoki. Arguably the 2 biggest stars in the whole history of Japanese wrestling. The only other person who's up there is the guy who trained them. You know Bubba and Inoki as the founders of All Japan and New Japan Pro Wrestling respectively. You may know that they used to team together at one stage when they were younger, and you may also know that they didn't really like each other, putting it mildly. Bubba and Inoki turned out to be, well, completely different people. But where did the differences between the pair come from? Because it wasn't always that way. We're talking about 2 wrestlers who didn't just come up together, they trained together and made their wrestling debuts on the exact same night. Bubba and Inoki, in another world, could have been thick as thieves rather than chalk and cheese. Still, fate and pro wrestling had other ideas. To tell the story of how things between Giant Bubba and Antonio Inoki turned so sour, we have to go back to a time long before New Japan and All Japan. Both Bubba and Inoki are gone now, but we must turn back the clock to a time when they were young and fresh-faced. The nature of how the careers of Bubba and Inoki played out, particularly in the 1960s, when they both wrestled for the Japanese Pro Wrestling Alliance, or JWA, doesn't just tell the tale of how they ended up being huge rivals at the helm of opposing promotions, it tells the story of how both men built the foundations of their entire character and pro wrestling philosophy. Exactly what they would call on when, in the early 1970s, they both built major promotions based around their vision of what pro wrestling should be. We'll start at a time when, well, neither of them were even in the dojo. Naturally, this story, at least in the beginning, will feature Rikidozan, the icon, the father of pro res, the most influential figure of them all, and one of the most popular. In his time, he was a hero. Rikidozan may not have been the first person to bring pro wrestling to Japanese shores. There were several women's wrestling exhibitions in the late 1940s for a start, won by Mildred Burke, but Rikidozan, as a wrestler, saw fit to carry a nation's wounded identity on his shoulders in the years after World War II, defeating a long line of American wrestlers from 1951 onwards. The names would get bigger and bigger as the decade went on. He founded the JWA, and by the time he wrestled a series of bouts against Lou Thesz, he was already an icon. One particular match from this Thesz series drew a quite ludicrous rating. 87% of all Japanese TV owners watched it. As much as Rikidozan is like that of a star that burns ridiculously brightly for a pretty short length of time, such were his achievements, it's also a tale of a tough man, someone who didn't exactly come from an advantageous background, who took no prisoners and certainly had a good few connections to the underworld. He was not ethnic Japanese. In fact, he was born Kim Sin-rak in 1924 in Korea, specifically in South Hamgyong province, which is now part of the DPRK. He moved to Japan in 1940 and took the name Mitsuhiro Momota, but in Japanese society he was classed as a Zainichi Korean, or a Korean in Japan. Zainichi Koreans faced a lot of discrimination and had significantly less rights than Japanese citizens, particularly following World War II, and Rikidozan was not exempt from this. Still, not long after he entered sumo in 1940, where he took the name of Rikidozan, a story was kind of concocted that presented him as being born in Omura, Nagasaki. Rikidozan did very well as a rikishi through the 1940s, achieving as high a rank as sekiwake. However, he made the surprise decision to retire in 1950. Sources differ as to why he made the decision. Some say that his Korean heritage meant that the association would have never promoted him higher than sekiwake, while others say that he actually was being considered for a promotion to azeki, the last rank below yokozuna, at the time of his retirement. Rikidozan did some odd jobs, primarily selling black market goods to American GIs, for a short time, before an American promoter and wrestler, Bobby Bruns, enticed him to the ring during a tour of Japan in 1951. The rest, as they say, is history. Over the following years, Rikidozan would quickly build a huge following despite his relative inexperience. He may not have had the wrestling skill of someone like Lou Fez, but he had a certain fire, a knack for the big comeback perhaps, usually with many chops and his signature kesagiri, a chop to the brain. Seeing as an American tour brought him to the squared circle, Rikidozan was trained in a wholly American style of pro wrestling where that fiery comeback, paired with his natural toughness, would see him shine. And by the time that he formed the JWA in 1954, he was already a well-known star. He was also a hard-living man, a very heavy partier and drinker, one who would quite often get into brawls and almost seemed to revel in being boorish. This is a man who, if he felt that someone was wasting his time in a conversation, would register his disinterest by pulling down his pants and masturbating. And yes, he most certainly had a temper, one that he would at times be required to channel in the ring. One of the most famous early Rikidozan matches, a 1954 bout against partner-turned-rival and famed judoka Masahiko Kimura, would be one of the earliest pro-res matches that turned into a shoot. Kimura looked to expose the business in the build-up, saying that Rikidozan's hard image was pure showbiz compared to his legitimate background. 15 minutes into their sellout main event, Kimura hit Rikidozan in the groin, at which point they both started firing live rounds. Rikidozan responded with several hard chops and kicks, sending Kimura crumpling and causing him to win a match that beforehand the pair had agreed to draw. Or at least, that's what Kimura thought they'd agreed on, anyway. Although he entered the ring less as the 60s came along, Rikidozan matches would still attain huge attention, and they'd often be hard-hitting affairs. A series of bouts with Freddie Blassie, nicknamed Vampire in the Japanese press due to his excessive biting, were so violent that they caused several old men watching to die of heart failure. That is, if you bought into Blassie's gloriously kayfabe stories. One particular thing I always find amusing is that in 1961, Rikidozan fought a strongman from Canada. His name was Antonio Barichevich, but you likely know him as the Great Antonio. The bell rang and Antonio immediately started trying to shoot on Rikidozan, who promptly beat the shit out of him and ended the contest quickly, with Antonio getting beaten yet further in the locker room. And then, many years later, Antonio gets brought into New Japan to face Inoki as an old opponent of Rikidozan. He tries to do the same thing, and he gets the shit beaten out of him again in footage that's gone pretty viral over the years. Yes, Rikidozan also beat the crap out of the Great Antonio, 16 years before Inoki did. These are a few various facets of the man that was Rikidozan. To go through everything would obviously require a whole video of its own, and this is supposed to be a video about Giant Bubba and Antonio Inoki. But these are famous events that make up the man, and Bubba and Inoki are two wrestlers that, in a way, Rikidozan built. Despite everything else, one of the man's greatest legacies is as a trainer. Famous Rikidozan students include Kintaro Oki, who we'll be seeing more of in a bit as he's one of JWA's top stars, Katetsu Yamamoto, a fine wrestler who would head New Japan's dojo from the 80s onwards, training a ridiculous amount of guys, Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Jushin Liger, Akira Maeda, Nobuhiko Takada, Shinsuke Nakamura, Prince Devitt and many more. Hiro Matsuda would go to America and also train many stars, Ted DiBiase, Scott Hall, Riki Choshu, Keiji Muto, many more besides, and, most famously of them all, Hulk Hogan. And then, even on top of all of that, you have Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. In the early days of pro res, there were two main pathways into pro wrestling. The main one, much like Rikidozan, was the path for former sumo wrestlers or rikishis, and the other one was a path for judokas and other martial artists. Most of the other native wrestlers in the JWA fit into the sumo path, such as the likes of Toyonobori and Azuma Fuji, the latter joining JWA in 1955, even after attaining the rank of Yokozuna in sumo. Neither Baba nor Inoki would really fit into this path of success in combat sports before pro wrestling. Inoki did learn karate when he was a child, while Baba didn't practice any martial art. Shohei Baba, who was born in 1938 and hailed from Niigata, was successful in sports, mind. That sport being baseball. He played for the Yomiuri Giants for 5 years as a pitcher, the biggest baseball team in the country. However, he would only ever play in 3 major league games before going down to the minors for more cultivation. Baba's time at the Giants came to an end in 1959, and unfortunately a severe arm injury soon after would curtail his professional baseball career. However, he did by this stage already know Rikidozan. They'd met at functions, and Rikidozan was pretty frickin' impressed by his size, seeing as Baba stood at around 6'8" due to gigantism, easily making him the biggest person to ever play Major League Baseball in Japan at that time. Rikidozan often encouraged Baba to give up baseball and come train pro wrestling with him, and after his baseball career ended, well, he decided to do exactly that. He did also have agents sniffing around who wanted to make him an actor or TV personality due to his height, but he chose to go the wrestling route. Inoki's pathway into wrestling was perhaps a bit more tricky due to where he ended up. Born in 1943 in Yokohama, Kanji Inoki's family moved to Sao Paulo in 1957, enticed by the opportunities there for Japanese emigres. While Inoki did learn karate as a child, as mentioned, his proficiency was on the track. The young Inoki was an excellent school athlete, breaking national shot put records in both Japan and Brazil. But it wasn't until 1960 when he'd have a chance meeting with Rikidozan, who was touring the country and had been made aware of the young Inoki's track exploits. Rikidozan met Inoki, examined his body, not as tall as Baba but still pretty damn big at over 6 foot and pretty strong, and just about immediately said to the young man that he should come back to Japan with him, soon rechristening him Antonio Inoki to allude to his time in Brazil and give him a bit more mystery as a wrestler. And so, the fate of both Inoki and Baba was sealed. They'd both start training at the JWA's dojo at virtually the same time. By this stage, Rikidozan was 35. More than a wrestler, he was a businessman with a great deal of other interests, not all of which were necessarily above board, and as such he was looking for those who could succeed him. Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki were presented as big deals even before they made their professional debuts. Rikidozan showed these young, strong and tall Japanese athletes to the press alongside another new wrestler, Kintaro Oki, a South Korean amateur wrestler who'd actually entered Japan illegally just to be trained by Rikidozan. Rikidozan's long-term plan was for Baba and Inoki to be cultivated so that they could hold the fort in Japan once he retired, while Oki would, he hoped, eventually be the star of a planned JWA expansion in South Korea. Inoki and Baba made their debut on the same night, September the 30th, 1960, again with significant fanfare. Baba actually won his first ever match against Yonitaro Tanaka, while Inoki lost to Oki, who'd made his debut a few months previously. Baba and Inoki would face off against each other a great deal in these early years. However, Inoki would never beat Baba, who won the lion's share of their matches, and the rest were drawn. With this in mind, it's fair to say that, of the two, Baba was considered to have the potential to be the biggest star in the eyes of JWA and Rikidozan. When it came time for the two wrestlers to mature further, their paths would again differ. In 1961, Giant Baba was to go further down the Rikidozan path, going on a big foreign excursion to the States in order to receive a proper American wrestling education. Inoki, meanwhile, was to stay in Japan. Essentially, he would be Rikidozan's assistant, learning directly from the boss. This wasn't necessarily the easiest time for Inoki. He would have to wait on Rikidozan hand and foot, the man was a harsh trainer, and yes, every so often, Inoki would have to take a beating if he made a mistake. Baba's own handler in the US, a man named Kazuo Okamura, but better known as Great Togo, would also often treat Baba harshly after matches, beating him with wooden shoes as a way of teaching him respect, something that tended to disgust the other people in the locker room. However, something a little unexpected happened with Baba in America. Obviously it was hoped he would succeed in both his performances and his training, but it wasn't quite as expected that he'd get so over. Baba was a hit in the States. In a time before Andre, he became the premier giant. He was very athletic at the time, especially for someone billed at 6'10", and he could work a lot better than many of the other more generic foreign heels that were kicking around. Before long, he was more than just a foil for the patriotic Americans in the traditional post-war themed home heroes versus evil foreigners bouts. Baba the Giant, as he was billed, was soon headlining cards against the top stars of the day, the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Buddy Rogers, Johnny Valentine, Freddie Blassie, and Lou Thesz. Initially not earning a huge amount in his excursion despite his quick advance up the cards, his bookings soon became far too lucrative for that arrangement to stay put. By 1963, Baba was a headline act all over America for both the NWA and Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF, and he was earning pretty good cash in that role, although Great Togo was still presumably taking the lion's share. It is entirely plausible that Baba could have held on to this arrangement long after any foreign excursion was due to end, perhaps even forever. However, fate had other ideas, and he would be forced into making a decision. So, we go to December the 8th, 1963. Rikidozan is still hugely popular when it comes to the ring. Feuds against the likes of Freddie Blassie and the Destroyer, Dick Bayer, attract huge crowds and TV audiences. His appetite for partying and drinking hadn't exactly been tempered. On this day he was a guest on a radio show and was, by all accounts, already quite drunk by that point. He also, on this day, makes a deal with a sumo stable master that would have seen Antonio Inoki become a sumo apprentice in exchange for his help in promoting a foreign tour, a deal that was very much against Inoki's will and almost caused him to quit, although he appeared accepting of it to Rikidozan. Following his radio appearance, he would spend the evening in a popular Tokyo night spot called the New Latin Quarter, which is where he would get into an altercation with a young Yakuza member named Katsushi Murata. The pair bumped into each other, Rikidozan shouted that he'd stepped on his foot, and then shoved and started beating Murata as he tried to defend himself. As he mounted the guy who bumped him to lay down more punishment, Murata produced a long knife and stabbed Rikidozan once in the left abdomen. Now, Rikidozan should obviously have gone to a hospital to get patched up properly, but he didn't want the media attention that would come with doing so. Instead, he was taken to an obstetrics hospital, where a gynecologist and surgeon he knew performed an outpatient procedure, repairing the holes in his small intestine. Despite the punctures, Rikidozan would have probably been fine had he rested for a while. Over the next couple of days, high-ranking members of Murata's clan came to Rikidozan's home to apologise profusely for the incident. Reportedly, even Murata himself, who took a further beating from his clan once he'd admitted what he'd done, came to apologise personally, and Rikidozan accepted those apologies. However, he wasn't resting. After the procedure, he basically continued drinking and eating heavily, just as before. A few days after the stabbing, Rikidozan's condition worsened dramatically, and he had to be rushed back to hospital for a second surgery. However, there wasn't much that could be done, and Rikidozan passed away on December the 15th at the age of 39, 1 week after the stabbing. The cause of death was internal hemorrhage and peritonitis. Murata, his assailant, would be charged with manslaughter and serve 7 years in prison, later making a visit every year to the grave of Rikidozan to apologise further until his own death in 2013. The shocking death of such a national hero poleaxed the country. 12,000 people would attend Rikidozan's funeral on December the 20th, and Lord knows how many saw his procession. Those close to him who knew the details could only mourn at how senseless and preventable his death was. Even those who knew the extent of his injury at the hands of that knife assumed that he would recover in due course, and given different choices, he more than likely would have. But in the months following the death of Rikidozan, the tragedy for JWA would give way to scandal. Rikidozan's popularity and heroic status acted as something of a shield for the ties that a lot of executive people in the company had with the underworld. Indeed, Rikidozan perhaps had the most of them all. He had many ties with organisations who had a lot of money in JWA, was always seemingly away whenever the heat started to rise, and was apparently a very paranoid man at the end of his life, often sleeping with a weapon close at hand. With Rikidozan now gone, 1964 would see the extent of those ties revealed in the press. These ties would cause sponsors and TV channels to drop the JWA. Toyonobori was quickly installed as the company's ace following Rikidozan's death, not to mention part of the company's leading counsel, but he couldn't stop the rot, and other executives in the company had issues with the amount of money that Toyonobori spent on gambling. Not necessarily morally, but they saw it more as an opening to oust him. It seemed inevitable that the house that Rikidozan had built would crumble with his death. In the eyes of the higher-ups at the JWA, there was only one person who had a chance of saving them. The JWA, now led by a council consisting of wrestlers Toyonobori, Yoshino Sato, Kokichi Endo and Michiaki Yoshimura, made the call to Giant Baba, wanting him to come back. The JWA, in decline, could in no way guarantee that Baba was going to make as much money back in Japan as he was currently making in the States, and Baba's manager, Great Togo, was naturally in his ear telling him that he should stay abroad, JWA be damned. By this stage, Baba was headlining shows with Bruno Sammartino at MSG. The importance of this decision cannot be overstated. If Baba chose not to come back, JWA would have almost certainly been finished off. The entire history of pro-res would have completely changed. I'd say there's a fair argument for this decision being the most important in the whole history of pro wrestling in Japan. And of course, in spite of the potential success and money that was on offer in the US, Baba made the decision to return home. From April 1964, JWA will once again be Baba's home. And needless to say, he's got work to do, particularly as the cleanup of various figures with far too many underworld connections continues in the JWA. On his return, Baba essentially replaced Toyonobori, who didn't particularly get along with him, and was fast-tracked into the ace position, with Yoshino Sato also having a prime position on the card. 1965 is a year of slow rebuild, but it's also a year of upheaval. The four-wrestler council at the head of JWA doesn't work out. A dispute with Toyonobori over his loss of the ace position, as well as his tendency to gamble, eventually results in his ousting at the end of the year. And he decides to form a new promotion, poaching several members of the roster for Tokyo Pro Wrestling. And one of the guys he poached? Yep, Antonio Inoki. With any possibility of Inoki becoming an apprentice Rikishi removed by Rikidozan's death, he had been on his own foreign excursion since 1964. His trip was more typical than the success that Baba had, largely wrestling as a standard foreign heel named Tokyo Tom for the NWA and Central States, but the start of 1966 would see him rather dramatically switch over to this brand new promotion. He had several reasons, the main one being that Toyonobori was Inoki's best friend in the entire JWA setup and had been since his training days. When Rikidozan scolded and beat Inoki, Toyonobori was the one there to console him. With Toyonobori's ousting, Inoki felt his prospects in the JWA didn't look particularly good. Toyonobori basically said to him that everyone in the company was entirely behind Baba and he'd essentially be treated as an outsider in the JWA if he went back there. One other wild detail of this exercise: Toyonobori did this whole meeting in Hawaii at the same time that a JWA training camp was going on there, with Baba, the council, and everyone else in the same freaking location, and Inoki training with them. At the end of the camp, Inoki made an excuse as to why he couldn't go back with everyone else, and then the JWA was blindsided a few days later by Inoki returning on a plane with Toya Nobori, announcing his arrival in the new Tokyo Pro Wrestling promotion. Just to add to all this tumult, another ousted JWA executive, Isao Yoshihara, would form another new promotion in the middle of 1966, the IWE, or International Wrestling Enterprise, with Hiro Matsuda. While all of this seems rather sensational, JWA were able to weather this initial storm. Tokyo Pro, despite featuring Toya Nobori and Inoki, weren't able to gather all that much in the way of momentum, mainly due to the JWA's exclusive working relationship with the NWA, limiting their choice of foreign talent. The clean-up of JWA's image following the installation of Bubba as top star was, by and large, working out. Bubba was seen to be, and indeed was, thoroughly clean, while the JWA itself had thoroughly cooperated with various police investigations. Ridding the company of once very powerful executives with ties to the underworld wasn't exactly straightforward, and caused more than a few serious threats to come their way, but they weathered those too. Tokyo Pro, on the other hand, was hamstrung immediately by Toya Nobori's aforementioned gambling vices. A successful October debut card featuring Inoki main eventing against Johnny Valentine was not followed up on, and soon enough the talent, including Inoki, became disgruntled by the company's mysteriously tight budget. The final straw occurred a mere month later. Inoki pulled out of a card at the last minute after Toya Nobori took his performance fee for a show, breaking away immediately and even making steps to form a company with other disgruntled wrestlers back then. While this didn't occur, it's intriguing to think that New Japan could have possibly started there and then, 6 years before it actually did. With the friendship between Inoki and Toya Nobori broken, the entire setup crumbled in legal scuffles, and eventually the remnants of Tokyo Pro merged with the newer promotion, the IWE, at the start of 1967. This outfit would last a great deal longer. Inoki, burned by this experiment, makes a deal at the start of the year to get back into JWA with other homegrown Tokyo Pro wrestlers. In the end, Inoki's standing in the JWA wasn't hurt a whole lot by his temporary switch. The narrative that they pushed from the beginning, even in the press, was that he'd been misled by Toya Nobori, who'd taken advantage of the young Inoki, using his potential star power for his own gain. Indeed, when he made his proper return to JWA in 1967, he would soon be thrust into his biggest role to date. Rikidozan's two great chargers, the pair who debuted on the same night back in 1960, were about to join forces to take on the best tag teams that the USA could offer. The official return of Antonio Inoki to the JWA was announced in April of 1967. By this time, Bubba was a champion both in singles and tag competition. He'd long held the NWA International Championship, the title that had originally belonged to Rikidozan, for 5 whole years, and was won by Bubba in November 1965 after beating Dick the Bruiser in a match for the vacant belt. Not only that, but he was the NWA International Tag Champ. He'd held that belt for over a year with the Fireball Kid, Michiaki Yoshimura. By this stage, JWA were happily back running shows in most of the major wrestling venues, old and new. They stopped using the venue that Rikidozan built, an arena-cum-entertainment palace-cum-office called the Ricky Sports Coliseum in 1966 as something of a break from the past, but they were regularly at the likes of the Dinen Coliseum and Kurame Kokukikan, the old sumo hall. At the end of 1966, JWA ran the very first ProRes show at a pretty new location that had been built for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, the Nippon Budokan, with Giant Bubba defending his title against Fritz von Erich. I feel like there should be a bit of a note here when it comes to watching old JWA stuff and the like. Is it something that you should do? What should you expect? Well, the answer to the first question is a definite yes. There is plenty of good stuff to be found in the old JWA. You should obviously expect a slower pace and lots of battling in holds. The style of the JWA is very similar to that of contemporary American wrestling from the period, as that's what Rikidozan was taught in, and in turn, that was taught in the dojo. A lot of the main events are going to be Broadways, and there will certainly be draws, double countouts, and so on. This is not Kins Road by any stretch of the imagination, although it's definitely closer to what 1970s All Japan was. Giant Baba, as top star, was very capable of this sort of match. The 6'10" man with the rather odd body was always more athletic than he may seem, even channeling that when needed in his later years, but this is a time when Baba would happily go 60 minutes plus on command. One particular match that demonstrates Baba's strong athleticism comes from the JWA period, a July 1970 bout against Dory Funk Jr. in the Osaka Furitsu gym, when a heat wave apparently made it so hot that contact with the mat would burn the wrestler's flesh. Despite rest holds being virtually impossible because of this, Baba and Dory Funk still went over 50 minutes to a double countout. A lot of Baba's frequent opponents would, of course, be champions themselves. He often faced the likes of Texas champ Fritz von Erich, WWF champ Bruno Sammartino, and the man he perhaps considered his greatest opponent of all, NWA champion Gene Kaniski, with one particular match against him, an August 1967 clash that sold out Osaka Stadium with well over 25,000 people, being cited by the man himself as his greatest ever bout. Japan vs USA was still the primary theme of every JWA card, and Baba was more than capable of maintaining that line. With him on top, Pro-Res was now, once again, highly popular, and competition was only going to fan its flames. Said competition came from the aforementioned IWE, or International Wrestling Enterprise. This promotion managed to gain much more of a foothold than Toyonobori's short-lived Tokyo Pro. Indeed, the former Rikishi was one of its main stars alongside Hiro Matsuda and even Giant Baba's old US manager, Great Togo. January 24th, 1968 sees possibly the first time that two major promotions would butt heads on national television, with two cards going directly against each other. TBS runs an IWE card that features Lou Fez taking on Danny Hodge for Fez's original world title, one that apparently went all the way back to Frank Gotch, while NTV run a JWA card headlined by Giant Baba defending his title against Crusher Lisowski. The JWA won the day with a rating of 48, while the IWE earned 26. In short, a hell of a lot of people that day were watching wrestling, and Pro-Wrestler's second big boom period is well and truly here. With this in mind, it's unfortunate that quite a lot of significant footage from this time, including the aforementioned Fez Hodge match, appears to be lost to time. Watchers of Showa-era Pro-Res from the 1960s have similar troubles to those who watch old TV shows from the time period, with lots of old footage either being lost or erased. There's not even that much footage out there of the BI Cannon team that we're about to cover. With competition from the IWE heating up and pro wrestling firmly back in the hearts of people across Japan, the decision was made to put the two big guys together at last. In October of 1967, Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki teamed together for the first time. The Baba Inoki team, known as the BI Cannon, will be the definite leading lights of this second boom. They may well have only been truly together for a few years, but they will win the NWA International Tag Team titles 4 times in that period for a combined total of 1,444 days with the straps, meaning they were champions close to every day that they were an active team. Over this time, they'll defend the belts against the best duos the US can offer: Crusher and Dick LaBruza, Sammartino and Ray Stevens, Danny Hodge and Wilbur Snyder, the Funk Brothers. It's quite the star-studded lineup, and the tag setting does allow for more clean finishes in these bouts. With the formation of the BI Cannon, Inoki is now unquestionably the closest to Baba when it comes to the home team and where they stand on the card. This somewhat annoys one of the other top stars, Kintaro Oki, who makes a pretty big noise about going to IWE. While this would have been a big coup, Oki is soon placated through being rewarded another old Rikidozan belt, the All Asia Heavyweight title, and he stays with JWA. The IWE competition also sputters around this time. Hiro Matsuda leaves after a dispute with Great Togo, who then leaves himself soon after, taking a beating from another wrestler, Gantetsu Matsuoka, and referee Yusef Turk in his hotel room. Fez and the American talent follow soon after, and the IWE stand-in diminishes somewhat. However, they will still stick around as the number 2 promotion, headed up by stars such as Rusha Kimura and Thunder Sugiyama, while also bringing in foreign talent such as Vern Gagne and other AWA competitors, Billy Robinson and Andre the Giant. The IWE were actually the first Pro-Res promotion to bring Andre over. They were also the first Japanese promotion to win a steel cage match. The dream team of Baba and Inoki is popular enough for JWA to be enjoying the same sort of success that they were getting during the heyday of Rikidozan. Even if they may not necessarily have reached some of the man's craziest peaks, they have a consistency and stability. So it seemed, anyway. These are unquestionably good times, and JWA wants to consolidate that position. Indeed, they don't particularly want competition to crop up from anywhere, and media articles about Great Togo and Lou Fez potentially setting up a new promotion, this despite Togo's ousting from JWA in the wake of Rikidozan's death, and somewhat violent running out of the IWE, gives them cause to be nervous. And so, well, why don't you start running your own competition? In 1969, JWA headed Togo and Lou Fez, who it turns out was having his name co-opted by Togo's exercise and possibly wasn't remotely aware of the whole thing, off at the pass by making a deal with a second network. NET TV, a once educational channel that had switched to general programming in the 1960s and would later be known as TV Asahi. The deal was fully completed in May of 1969, meaning JWA now had 2 weekly programs, The Diamond Hour on Nippon TV and World Pro Wrestling on NET TV. A major part of this deal was that both networks would feature a star that was entirely exclusive to them and would not be shown on the other program. NTV's was Giant Baba, and NET TV's was Antonio Inoki. In creating this deal, the JWA's locker room did indeed become somewhat split into 2, decades before anything like this occurred elsewhere. Those high up in the JWA may well have not considered the potential ramifications of doing this, thinking that it was just another deal, and that even if you had 2 factions in the locker room representing 2 different networks, there was no reason why they couldn't happily coexist. They were, of course, one. The ramifications of the deal didn't just involve Inoki and Baba, after all. Other guys were part of the split too. For example, young ex-judoka and hot prospect Seiji Sakaguchi would be with Baba on the NTV side, while the likes of Kintaro Oki and Katetsu Yamamoto would be with Inoki on the NET TV side. Inoki, surprisingly enough, was one of the first to voice a concern that this deal would cause factions to form in the locker room. And he'd be right, but a lot of the main friction came between the 2 networks themselves. There's even instances of NTV running counter-programming to World Pro Wrestling featuring Giant Baba, who's their guy and reportedly wasn't big on this whole deal in the first place, while political machinations of cards backed by the networks increased to a huge scale. JWA haven't just created the quite significant rod for their own back, they've basically built a frickin' bomb and stored it under their table. And we'll see how all of this plays out. Despite all of this kerfuffle, there still really wasn't much at all in public to suggest that Baba and Inoki weren't firm friends who'd come up together and were now enjoying being at the forefront of the JWA and Puroresu. They'd still often take time to train together, usually with Carl Gotch whenever he, perhaps the foremost trainer of them all in wrestling, came over for a tour. Throughout the BI Canon days, and as a new decade began, everything was seen to be fine. However, for all the success, the pair did have a certain frustration, one that they may not have necessarily communicated to each other that well and would have certainly gone about trying to combat in different ways, but still one they shared. At various times, and usually individually, Baba and Inoki did make entreaties to the higher-ups at JWA to let them face each other, for the BI Canon to go off, in other words. Baba and Inoki hadn't faced each other in competition since their earliest days, and even if this tag team was so successful and making so much money, they both felt it important that they should face each other again. Not only would it likely be a huge success, but it would also be the first major rivalry between 2 native Japanese wrestlers, with Baba and Inoki going against each other for the NWA International Heavyweight title. Inoki certainly pushed the idea more than Baba, which you can probably expect. He was still very much the number 2 guy and wanted to show that he could be the number 1, although Baba himself was not at all opposed to facing Inoki at this stage. However, the JWA executives would consistently refuse them, neither wishing to upset the apple cart when it came to the deals they had with NTV and NET TV, nor wanting to deviate from the tried and true formula of Japan versus the rest of the world, mainly the United States. The inability of Bubba and Inoki to get a match against each other continued to frustrate both of them, especially Inoki, and it was only a matter of time before one of these two would take matters into their own hands. And if you know these two well, I think you can hazard a guess as to who that was going to be. It took until May of 1971 for the incident to occur. For a change, it's not Inoki going to business for himself in a BI Cannon match and firing live rounds on his partner. By this stage, Inoki has a singles title of his own, the NWA United National Championship, which he won in March after beating the veteran John Tolos in Los Angeles. The incident takes place during the annual World League tournament. This competition, won by Bubba in 1966, 67, 68 and 1970, and by Inoki in 1969, had always been booked in such a way that Bubba and Inoki wouldn't have faced each other during it, usually with Japanese wrestlers taking on foreigners. The end of the 1971 tournament sees Inoki wrestle the Destroyer to a double countout, meaning that Bubba's semi-final match against Abdullah the Butcher is for the big prize. While that's going on, Inoki stages an impromptu press conference in his dressing room where he openly challenges Bubba to a match, something that was absolutely not planned or agreed on, least of all by Bubba. Following Bubba's victory against Abdullah, Inoki even shakes his hand in the locker room, a rather awkward moment that's captured by a picture. The challenge was made official the following day and presented to the JWA's commission. After all this hoo-ha, the challenge is officially rejected on May the 28th, and it's pretty much confirmed that the big Inoki vs Bubba match isn't going to happen. Needless to say, Inoki's big challenge to Bubba generated a lot of media attention. It certainly sent tons flapping, and you'd have thought that these tons would have given JWA cause to actually give it the nod, although they held firm. The way Inoki went about the challenge made Giant Bubba absolutely furious. Even if he wasn't opposed to facing Inoki, what he saw was Inoki going into business for himself, raising his own profile by using his name. There were other backstage goings-on that hardly helped matters, but Inoki's challenge to Bubba on May 19th can certainly be thought of as the friendship-ended point between the two. Inoki wasn't exactly shutting up about it either. In a refrain that would become very familiar over the years, he pointed to the JWA's rejection of his challenge to Bubba as a tacit admission that he was the better wrestler and fighter all along. For Bubba, Inoki going outside the traditional practices of the business in this way, not to mention all the smack that he was now thrown in his direction, was unforgivable. Truthfully, however, even if the BI Cannon tag team was such a success, the differences between Bubba and Inoki were already quite marked. One of them was quite a reserved man who liked to keep a private life, while the other most certainly already relished the spotlight and all that came with it. Both Bubba and Inoki would get married in the second half of 1971. While Bubba's marriage to Motoko Kawai was a quiet ceremony in Hawaii that wasn't even made public until many years later, Inoki's marriage to actress Mitsuko Basho was an impossibly glitzy event that reportedly cost 100 million yen to put together. By this stage, the BI Cannon team was already a little on the rocks. Bubba and Inoki hadn't had a lot to say to each other during a July title defence against Ivan Koloff and Dutch Savage, and afterwards Bubba announced that he wished to take a short break from the Cannon. The tension is very much rising in JWA, and it doesn't just include those tensions between the two stars at the top of the company. Over the course of the next 12 months, everything is going to change. The plot started to take form in November of 1971, with the central figures being Inoki, another wrestler named Umanosuke Oida, and a disgruntled accountant named Akimasa Kimura. All three were primarily annoyed at how JWA was being run. Despite the success of the last few years, their finances were still not in particularly great shape, and they suspected that executives such as Kokichi Endo and company president Junzo Hasegawa, more famously known as Yoshino Sato, who had gone back to his real name since retiring from the ring in 1967, were regularly skimming money off the top. They wished to hold the coup in quite spectacular fashion. In December, after petitioning the locker room in support of reforms, they would perform a hostile takeover that got rid of Endo, Hasegawa and Michaki Yoshimura in one fell swoop while they were away at a golf tournament, with Inoki and Kimura taking the roles of president and vice president. The extremities of this plan was not exactly disclosed to all the wrestlers when they were petitioned about the possibility of reform, nor was it disclosed to Giant Bubba when they discussed it with him. Bubba recognised that there was certainly corruption, but thought it better that the execs stepped down gradually and gracefully, rather than essentially being decapitated all at once. As far as the plan to make Inoki and Kimura the heads go, it seems as though only those two and Oida knew about that. As far as wrestlers knew, there would be an extraordinary board meeting on November 28th. 2 days before that, however, Oida ratted out the conspirators. He informed Hasegawa and Yoshimura about the plot to replace them, also claiming that Baba himself was deeply involved. However, when Baba was grilled about it, it became clear that he didn't know the extent of Inoki's plan. For theories about just why Oida deviated away from the plot, and indeed a lot of details about this planned coup, I am referring a great deal to an excellent series of articles called Broken Crown, The Fall of Japan Pro Wrestling, written by Kinchstalker and linked to in the description. The general belief is that Oida didn't feel secure in his own standing after the coup had taken place. He felt that a lot of the origins of the plot came from disgruntled chats between himself and Inoki, but he wasn't guaranteed a place on the board following the coup, and possibly wondered if he may have taken something of a fall afterwards. With no guaranteed seat at the table, he decided to make the play. Plans were still going ahead, with Kimura appointed as an auditor in the wake of November 28th's board meeting. However, Inoki and Kimura were now planning to arrange the formation of a new company rather than take over JWA. Baba found out about this plan from Oida and promptly intervened, informing management of the plan, resulting in the immediate firing of Kimura. On December the 4th, Endo and Yoshimura made the decision to resign as executives, although they still retained roles in the company, while Baba stepped down from his less powerful role as chairman, with Kentaro Oki being promoted in his place. Oki, who had not been part of any of these reformation plans and long bore his own grudges over being passed over for the top face position, demanded, largely with the support of the locker room, that Inoki be expelled from the JWA immediately, even before the end of the current tour. This didn't happen straight away. There was enough time given for Baba and Inoki to wrestle one final and undoubtedly very cold match on December the 7th against the Funk Brothers, where they dropped the international tag team titles. Inoki didn't even return to the locker room after the match. He became aware of a plan to ambush and assault him as soon as he stepped foot back in there, and was whisked away to another room and then to a hospital in order to avoid such a thing happening. Antonio Inoki was officially fired from JWA on December the 13th, vacating the United National title, and the majority of the locker room were quite happy to see the back of him. There's even a picture where a lot of JWA wrestlers celebrate the sacking of Inoki with a toast. Baba himself very rarely commented on just what happened, but did so in the immediate fallout after Inoki and Kimura had branded him a traitor. He said that he and the wrestlers had supported reform in the company, but that Inoki's plan had gone well beyond that, and that he'd never had much trust for Kimura. If anyone could be branded a traitor in the fallout from this mess, it was Inoki. It's pretty fair to say that at this stage, any friendship or respect between the members of the once proud BI canon had now utterly disintegrated. As Inoki and Kimura licked their wounds in brief exile, they set about building the company that would become New Japan Pro Wrestling and would break in most every way from the old JWA style. Inoki gets back in touch with soon-to-be chairman Hisashi Shinma, an important figure who had previously been involved with the doomed Tokyo Pro, and Carl Gotch, his most important trainer, also comes into the fold. He even patches things up with Toya Nobori. The ex-Rikishi had retired in 1970, but came back in order to help New Japan for its first difficult year as an independent promotion, resolving to retire after the company found television. Meanwhile, the JWA may have looked forward to a less dramatic 1972, thinking that perhaps the drama of a coup was over. Giant Bubba was still there, as was Kentaro Oki and Seiji Sakaguchi, who by now is right near the top of the card, pushed hard essentially to try and fill the big Inoki-shaped hole. A few wrestlers who are loyal to Inoki have departed with him, such as Katetsu Yamamoto and rookies Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Kido, but some at JWA might have thought, a bit naively, that the trash had fully been taken out. But really, the drama at JWA was just beginning, and a lot of it, quite frankly, would be of their own doing. The failure of the coup and ousting of Inoki hadn't exactly fixed the core problems with the company, and they were about to embark down a road that would soon alienate their biggest star. That and the end of the BI canon had also largely signalled the end of a boom period. Business was slowly winding back down again, and JWA had 2 networked shows to try and fill. NET TV, broadcasters of the World Pro Wrestling show, did want to increase the amount they paid JWA, but only if they could start featuring Bubba, despite his exclusivity to Nippon TV. If JWA didn't agree to this, NET TV would drop the programme completely. Bubba, who had pretty much been against the whole NTV NET setup from the beginning, absolutely hated this proposal. However, his political power had diminished following Inoki's coup attempt and Kentaro O'Keefe taking the position of chairman as a result of that. And so the JWA board went ahead with it, and Bubba started featuring on World Pro Wrestling from April. The response from NTV was perhaps predictable. Negotiations between NTV and JWA quickly broke down over the Bubba exclusivity issue, and while JWA president Junzo Hasegawa thought that his federation was too big to just be dropped, well, he was won. NTV stopped broadcasting new JWA matches from May, terminating the Diamond Hour and broadcasting archived content in its place. The move from JWA to piss off NTV in this manner would prove, in every possible way, absolutely disastrous. Pretty much from that point on, Bubba was looking to leave. In July, he flat out stated that he wanted to do business with NTV, not saying the obvious part in public, that he'd already started his own negotiations with the network, and there really wasn't an awful lot JWA could do about it. As much as some of JWA's die-hard wrestlers thought Bubba to be another traitor and wished to do him a physical discourtesy, and as much as JWA tried their hardest to bring the giant back on board, there was little that could be done to change his mind on the matter. Bubba's final tour with JWA took place in August, and his final match with the company happened on August the 18th. He was booked at one point for an international heavyweight title match against Oki in September, but suspecting that Oki was likely to shoot on him during the bout, he simply chose to vacate the title instead. On August 29th, Bubba was officially gone from JWA and already deep in negotiations with NTV to start up his own wrestling promotion, the one that would eventually become All Japan Pro Wrestling. Whereas Inoki's New Japan struggled as an indie in its first year before finding television, AJPW moved fast, bolstered by already having the guarantee of TV programming. Several wrestlers who were loyal to Bubba jumped ship with him, he made negotiations and secured agreements with the NWA as quickly as possible, he found another useful agreement with the IWE, and even landed agreement and blessings from the family of Rikidozan. His sons Mitsuru and Yoshihiro would soon start work for the company, while his widow Kiko, alienated by the JWA not long after her husband's tragic death, wouldn't just have a seat on the board of directors, she would give Bubba custody of Rikidozan's 2 original versions of the International and All Asia heavyweight belts, the ones that only Rikidozan had ever worn. The message was absolutely clear. The true legacy of Rikidozan, the founding father of Pro Res, no longer lied with the JWA. It was here with Giant Bubba's AJPW. It's worth noting that the International Heavyweight title is nowadays a part of All Japan's main championship, the Triple Crown, alongside the old NWA United National and PWF Heavyweight Championship belts. All of these hammer blows, stemming directly from the JWA's terrible decision to shun Nippon TV, ended up being more than the original company could bear. The end of 1972, without Bubba, saw their share of the market shrink to the point where they were below the IWE, and their deal with NET TV had turned a fair bit sour as a result. NET TV were now looking towards Antonio Inoki's New Japan. A proposed last-ditch merger with New Japan was the one thing that could have in any way saved them, only for JWA to back out at the last moment. Once again, they believed their own hype, and sides formed. You had guys like Kentaro Oki vowing never to do business with Inoki, and believing that JWA's status as the original Pro-Res company would save them. A Breeze thinking that there was no way NET TV could abandon them completely. Seiji Sakaguchi, who'd been instrumental in setting up the prospective merger, was outmatched, and JWA decided to break off the merger. Once again, they'd made a terrible decision. With the merger abandoned, NET fully committed to broadcast in New Japan from March 1973, dropping all JWA programming in the process. The following month, on April 13th, a press conference was called at the grave of Rikidozan to announce the dissolution of the JWA. The majority of remaining JWA talent were merged into All Japan, where Baba's general disinterest in pushing them meant that they largely filled out the company's mid-card. Even the rookies who weren't guaranteed future ace and company star Jumbo Tsuruta were given preferential treatment over most of them. Sakaguchi would quickly join Inoki in New Japan. The mismanagement in the JWA was one reason why their business broke apart so spectacularly, in the midst of failed coups and foolish decisions that would see their most prized assets break apart acrimoniously, both with them and with each other. By the time that All Japan and New Japan formed, Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki were utterly fierce rivals. They had nothing but contempt for each other. Inoki would usually be the more vocal one, particularly during the earlier years of both companies, often commenting that if the pair ever had a proper fight, he would easily defeat his rival. Baba didn't often have too much to say in response, usually waving it away and saying that this was pro wrestling, not a street fight. Baba was more content to occasionally mock Inoki's exploits at Legitimacy. A somewhat viral and almost purposefully terrible mid-card match pitting Baba against Raja Lion in 1987, a 7-foot-plus Pakistani actor who was presented as a master kickboxer, is basically a comedic parody of Inoki's worked bouts against legit martial artists and boxers like Everett Eddy, Willem Ruska and Chuck Wepner. The two had completely different visions on what wrestling should be, both had a tremendous amount of success when it came to selling that type of vision, but yeah, in the end, they were never destined to get along. A lot of people who knew and worked with both of them said that even if JWA had been run perfectly, they were almost certain to fall out. And in the end, a lot of that had to do with Baba being the top star as opposed to Inoki. Inoki was absolutely jealous of that, and ultimately his frustrations in JWA and motivation for staging the big coup was based on that. One other thing I think is also worth noting is that the Baba Inoki narrative is something that does repeat a few times in other major rivalries through the history of pro res. You see echoes of it in places like the career of Akira Maeda, who championed his legitimacy at the expense of what he would call regular pro wrestlers. You might see it most of all in the rivalry between Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada. Kawada was an incredibly fit specimen, considerably fitter than Misawa, who often liked to party, certainly liked to smoke, and as ultra talented as he was, he didn't keep the same flawless level of conditioning that Kawada did. Inoki and Baba are quite similar in this regard, and just as Kawada was jealous of Misawa for being the top guy, even though he thought he was the superior athlete, the same was true of Inoki and Baba in the JWA. Now, if the shoe had been on the other foot, if Inoki had been the top star and not Baba, well, to be honest, as much as Baba is an entirely different, private, more reserved sort of person, I don't have too much reason to believe that Baba wouldn't have himself tried to replace him, albeit surely in a different sort of way, one that would perhaps have absolved him of any blame in the end. He was always the more subtle political player, as opposed to Inoki's sledgehammer. There is one last little epilogue of sorts. Despite the huge rivalry between Inoki and Baba, and the legitimate dislike that they had for each other, the pair would, for one night only, team again. The final year of the 1970s would see an all-star dream card on August 26th, a one-off show promoted by the Tokyo Sports newspaper that featured New Japan, All Japan and the IWE joining forces in the Nippon Budokan, main evented by the BI Cannon going against Tiger Jeet Sin and Abdullah the Butcher. The show sold out the Budokan, was apparently the first $1 million gate in the history of pro wrestling as a whole, and there is at least a handheld version of the show available, which almost makes it seem like a mythical occurrence. As you might expect, however, it took quite a bit of work to get Baba and Inoki in the ring at the same time. Tokyo Sports put together the All-Star Dream card to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the newspaper, with the original idea of putting Baba vs Inoki on in the main event, alongside other All Japan vs New Japan Dream matches. However, the politics of booking such a card would quickly prove unfeasible, especially when it came to the main event. Eventually the card would largely feature teams of multiple federations against each other, and a decision was made to reunite the BI Canon against a team of the fans' choosing, which ended up being the heel dream team of All Japan's Abdullah the Butcher and New Japan's Tiger Jeet Sin, whether that was the real result or not. Inoki, of course, certainly pushed for an Inoki vs Bubba bout. It had, after all, been a familiar refrain for years by that point, but Bubba was thoroughly negative on that front, also remarking coldly on the various comments against him that Inoki had made over the years. He did have a concern that if Bubba vs Inoki did go ahead, there was the possibility that Inoki would shoot on him, even commenting to the organisers at Tokyo Sports that he didn't want to put himself in the boots of Masahiko Kimura, the man who Rikidozan had started firing live rounds on 25 years previously. Nevertheless, despite the odd rocky moment, as well as the odd moment where the pair's old friendship would actually return, albeit briefly, the BI Canon reunion would go ahead. Just for one night, Japan's two most famous wrestlers put their differences aside for the greater good of celebrating pro wrestling as a whole, as well as celebrating the 20th anniversary of the nation's most famous sports paper. They went in, popped the crowd huge with their classic routine, took the requisite heat from Abbey and Sin, got the victory through an Inoki backslide in around 13 minutes, shook hands, and even had a little hug afterwards. All seems like it goes off fine. Until, of course, Inoki gets on the microphone. Kinch Stalker is once again thanked for translating his words. He thanks everyone for coming, says that Lord James Blears, AJPW figurehead, has given positive encouragement to him about the prospects of a match between him and Bubba, and says that the next time they meet in the ring, it would be a fight. Needless to say, this was not signed off on. Bubba, who could barely hear Inoki and was himself barely audible in the crowd's delirium, did say "let's do it" in response, but backstage quickly reasoned that he'd hardly said anything binding, and was reminded by the incident of exactly why he couldn't trust Inoki as far as he could throw him. Bubba and Inoki would never share a ring again. This final incident involving the two is an odd one. As much as one could have hoped that there were more occasions like this, and that the bad blood between the two wasn't quite so intense, it also showed the huge gulf of differences between the pair, and rather neatly showed why neither were able to trust the other in the end. Inoki could have perhaps gotten over that, if only to find an opportunity to go into business for himself, but well, that is kind of why Bubba, probably rightly, couldn't trust Inoki. The All-Star Dream card was a success, but there was pretty clearly no chance of a repeat performance afterwards. For Bubba and Inoki, it's one more night when both their immense characters and personalities would come to the forefront, the very things that allowed them both to build such successful wrestling promotions. And that didn't just happen overnight when they both left the JWA. The story of both Bubba and Inoki's time in Japan's first major wrestling company, from trainees to friends and tag partners to rivals, from colleagues to enemies, is a story of how the two most successful men in the history of pro res were made whole. Bye for now.